Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. This space we share these quiet stories, these slow moments, they matter. So if you enjoy this time we're about to spend together, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you know. And while you're here, I want to know something. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Which city? Which country? What time is it right now? Midnight? Maybe 3 in the morning? Let me know in the comments. I read every one. I always love seeing where this little moment of peace is reaching. Now, get comfortable. You don't need to do anything except breathe. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts quiet down. Because tonight, we're going somewhere heavy. We're stepping back into a time where pain was glory, where fear was a weapon, and where survival meant becoming something darker than human. We're going to meet the most terrible medieval warriors in history. Not terrible like bad at their job, no. Terrible like the kind of people whose names were whispered as warnings. Terrible like the kind of warriors whose footsteps made villages go still. These weren't just knights or soldiers. They were storms in armor. They were fire wrapped in skin. They weren't heroes. And they weren't always villains. But they were something else, something ancient, something awful, and something unforgettable. Our story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in silence. A cold silence. A silence broken only by the distant toll of a bell and the breath of a man who has seen too much. He stands at the edge of a cliff, armor dented, hands scarred, eyes empty. He isn't thinking about God or glory. He's thinking about the weight of the sword in his hand. How many it's silenced, how many faces he can't forget, how many names he never learned. His name? It doesn't matter yet. Because before we name the warrior, we have to understand the world that made him. Medieval Europe wasn't a map. It wasn't castles and dragons and shining tournaments. It was hunger, cold blood. It was a place where the strong didn't always win, but the brutal did. Where villages feared not just war, but the men war created. The first warrior we'll meet tonight was born in a winter so harsh it cracked stones. His mother died giving birth. His father was already a ghost sent to war and never returned. He was raised in a monastery not out of charity, but because no one else wanted him. The monks called him the Quiet One. Not because he was peaceful, but because he never cried. Not once. Even as a baby. By the age of 10, he could read Latin. By 12, he could break bones with his bare hands. The abbot didn't know what to do with him. One night, they caught him in the cellar, carving shapes into the wood of an old door, symbols no one recognized. Not crosses, not saints. Something older, something wrong. When asked what they meant, he only said, "They keep me still." At 15, he disappeared. No one saw him leave, no one tried to find him, but years later, stories began to spread of a mercenary who didn't speak, who wore no banner, who carried a rusted sword with no name, villages burned behind him, not always for money, sometimes just because. He didn't take trophies, he didn't boast, he didn't drink, but he never refused a job. Bandits hired him to destroy knights. Nobles paid him to erase villages. Once, he was paid to assassinate a priest. When he arrived at the church, he listened to the priest's sermon before walking to the altar and kneeling. The priest thought he had been spared, until the sword came down mid-blessing. People said his eyes never blinked, that his skin smelled of ash, that he didn't age. They gave him names: the Gray Blade, the Hollow Knight, the Death That Walks, but he never gave his own. And when someone asked him why he fought, he finally spoke, only once. He said, "Because the world deserves to remember what it made." Then he vanished. That's one kind of terrible, cold, silent, made not of hate, but of memory. But there were others, terrible in a different way. Warriors born not from grief, but from joy and destruction. There was a woman, her name mostly forgotten now, who led a band of riders across the northern forests. She didn't come from nobility. She wasn't trained by monks. She learned war from wolves. When she was 8, her village was taken by raiders, her father killed, her mother tied to a post and burned. She hid in the trees and watched it all. Didn't scream, didn't cry, just watched. She lived in those woods for 3 years, learned their language, learned to move like silence. Then one day she walked back into a village alone, covered in fur and blood. She asked for food. A man laughed. She killed him with a rock, took his bread, ate in silence. No one stopped her, because they saw something in her eyes, something not human. She didn't just fight, she hunted. Her blades were curved, fast, and dirty. She aimed for soft parts, behind the knees, under the ribs. She didn't believe in armor. She believed in speed, in surprise, in chaos. Her army grew not because she recruited, but because people followed her out of fear and admiration. She only killed warriors, but she made them scream. Once, a knight tried to duel her with honor. She spat in his face and stabbed him before he drew. Honor, she said, is the word men use when they plan to lose. Her legend grew. Mothers told their children, sleep or she'll come from the trees. Men who served her shaved their heads and painted their teeth red. They didn't chant before battle. They howled. And when she died, no one knows how. Or even when they say the trees in her forest stood still for a whole day. The birds silent. The wind holding its breath. That's another kind of terrible. One born not from sorrow, but rage shaped into precision. The medieval world created warriors like that, not just for war, but because fear was currency. Power wasn't just about land. It was about stories, about reputation. And some warriors fought not to win, but to be remembered. There was one knight his armor always blackened, even in summer. He refused to show his face, said it was cursed, said anyone who looked upon it would die within a year. People believed him, not because of magic, but because they wanted to. Fear made the world simpler. His sword was etched with scripture but upside down. His shield bore no crest, just a handprint, his own, burned in. They say he never prayed, but he always looked up before killing, and that his victims never bled. The wounds smoked instead. Of course, that's myth. Of course, he was just a man. But in the medieval world, just a man wasn't enough. You had to become legend, terrible, inescapable, larger than breath. And that meant becoming something else, something less soft. These warriors weren't symbols of bravery. They were echoes of what happens when humanity is stripped and only need remains. The need to win, to endure, to be feared. And when you close your eyes tonight and let your thoughts drift, you might wonder, how many of those terrible warriors were born just like you? Just someone caught in a storm of history, forced to survive in a world that offered no kindness. And how many of them chose it? Chose the blade, chose the blood, chose to become monsters because monsters weren't afraid. Either way, they existed. And their stories, softened by time, still whisper beneath the cobblestones and castle ruins, still echo in the wind through pine trees, still wait in the silence between battles when all the armor's been removed and all that remains is breath. Slow, cold, and terrible. They didn't always come from castles. Some of the most terrifying warriors in medieval history were born in mud, in hunger, in the long silence between church bells where faith couldn't reach. Because in the Middle Ages, war was not a profession, it was an inheritance. And violence, more often than not, wore the face of the desperate. Tonight, we continue drifting through that cold, unspoken world, where warriors weren't saints or villains, but shadows caught in motion. You're walking now, through a village that doesn't exist anymore. The houses are low and made of wattle and daub. The roofs sag. Smoke curls up from chimney holes like prayers with no direction. You pass a woman with no teeth. She doesn't look up. A dog growls softly from under a broken cart. Children stare, but not with curiosity. With calculation. Who are you? What do you have? Can you be hurt? And on the edge of this crumbling place stands a man. Or what's left of one. His hands are scarred with burn marks, knuckles thick like tree roots. He sharpens a blade, slowly, deliberately, not because he needs to, but because it calms him. They say he used to be a butcher, They say he used to be a monk. They say a lot. But the only thing everyone agrees on is this: don't look him in the eye. Once, during a famine, soldiers came to take what little food the village had left. They laughed, drank, took turns with cruelty. One of them kicked over a pot of barley, laughed. The man didn't speak. He simply picked up his cleaver and cut the soldier's hand off at the wrist. Before anyone could react, he'd killed 2 more. With no armor, no shield, just a blade and a rage that felt like silence. After that, the village fed him first. Not because they liked him, but because they were afraid not to. He didn't join armies. Armies came to him, paid him to fight. He refused gold, only accepted salt and honey. Said gold made men weak. He didn't use swords, said they were too elegant, too clean. He carried axes, short ones, meant for bone. Once, he fought off an entire mercenary company, alone. Not because he wanted to, but because they laughed when he asked them to leave. When it was over, he dragged their captain to the village square and whispered something in his ear before cutting his throat. The captain died smiling. No one ever found out why. But after that, people said the man had been cursed, that he couldn't die, that every time he was wounded, the wound closed with smoke. One night, a young warrior came to challenge him, wanted to make a name. The old man accepted. They fought in the dark, only lit by torchlight. The boy was fast, skilled, arrogant. He got in a good strike. The crowd gasped. The old man bled, but he didn't flinch, didn't blink. He dropped his blade, walked toward the boy, and embraced him, then crushed his ribs with bare arms. The boy died weeping, not from pain, from understanding. He had looked into the eyes of someone who had stopped being human a long time ago. That's one way to become terrible. Through loss so deep it hollows you out, until all that's left is instinct and muscle. But sometimes the most feared warriors were made not by loss, but by design. In the East, during the darkest winters, there were children bred for war. Not raised, bred, taken as infants, trained with no names, only numbers. They slept on stone, ate raw meat, were taught not to flinch, not to speak, not to love. The program was secret, hidden behind monastery walls that the world thought were filled with prayers. But behind those walls, boys learned to kill birds with thrown needles, learned to walk on hot coals without screaming, learned to recite scripture backwards while holding a dagger between their teeth. They were called the Ashlings because they rose from fire. When they turned 15, only 3 of the 100 remained. The rest? No one said. The survivors were assigned names taken from storms, hail, frost, smoke, and sent into the world with black cloaks and silver blades. They didn't fight for kingdoms. They didn't serve popes or emperors. They served silence. When nobles woke with their throats open, people whispered it was the Ashlings. When an entire garrison vanished overnight, leaving only birds pecking at empty armor, people whispered again. No one had seen them, no one ever would, but the fear spread. And in medieval Europe, fear was more powerful than any army. Once, a count tried to hire them, sent gold, letters, promises. The next morning, his castle was covered in ash. No fire had burned, but everything smelled like it had. The Ashlings weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They were warnings, walking omens. And when one of them was caught accidentally, during a storm, they hanged him in the square. Thought it was over, but in the morning, the body was gone. Only a pile of snow remained. Some say the Ashlings weren't even human, just something that wore our shape. That's another kind of terrible. Not just skilled, but unknowable. Built for fear, bred in silence. And then there were the ones who were made by history itself, by politics, by cruelty wrapped in law. Picture this: a knight stripped of his title, accused of treason for refusing to massacre peasants who couldn't pay taxes. His land taken, his name struck from the books, his family murdered to make an example. But he didn't die. He disappeared, into the woods, into the mountains, into legend. Years later, tales spread of a figure in black armor, tarnished and scorched, no crest, no banner. He rode a war horse with cracked hooves and eyes like smoke. He never spoke, but he always appeared when tax collectors came too close to starving villages, when lords built gallows for dissenters, when cruel sheriffs lit homes on fire. He came like thunder, and when he left, only the innocent remained, and the guilty were reduced to parts. They called him the Hollow Knight, the Broken Oath, the Last Law. But he didn't care for names. He just fought with a fury that seemed endless, a sadness that bled into rage, and then disappeared again. Was he real? Maybe not. Maybe he was the story peasants told themselves when they had nothing left. But fear doesn't care about truth. It cares about memory. And memory said, "Don't cross that bridge alone. Don't ride at night with fire in your eyes. Don't hurt those who have nothing because he might be watching." In the Middle Ages, terror often wore armor, but just as often, it wore a hood, a smile, a scar, a silence. Terrible warriors weren't always the loudest. Sometimes, they were the ones who didn't need to speak, because everything about them already said enough. And as the stars above you settle into place, as your breath slows, and the quiet wraps around your shoulders like a forgotten cloak, remember, history wasn't built by the gentle. It was built by the ones who refused to be erased, who let the world make them into monsters because monsters survived. Not all warriors were noble. Not all legends were clean, but they were real. And they walked among smoke and screams, and they left footprints that still haven't faded. You're still here, and the night is deeper now. The stars have shifted, the air around you has grown quieter, and the stories we carry are settling like dust on old armor. We've walked beside warriors born in silence, in grief, in the cracks between loyalty and vengeance. But there's more. There's always more. Because the most terrible medieval warriors didn't just fight battles, they shaped time. And some of them were never supposed to wield swords. They were sons of millers, daughters of servants, bastards with no names. And yet, the world carved them into iron. Take, for example, a woman who wore a crow's feather behind her ear and carried a blade longer than her arm. She was never knighted, never praised in court. But in the black valleys of the north, her name made grown men flinch. They say she once fought 5 soldiers at once, not with elegance, but with rage so steady it felt like prayer. She wasn't beautiful. Her teeth were crooked, her hands cracked, her voice deep and calm like frozen rivers. But her eyes, they said, were like a storm that forgot how to pass. Her village had been destroyed by tax mercenaries. She buried her son with her own hands, then vanished. When she returned, months later, she wasn't the same. She had taught herself how to kill. She made her own armor, piece by piece, from stolen scraps and iron rivets boiled in oil. She didn't scream in battle. She didn't speak at all, only fought. Efficient, cold, relentless. They called her the Widow of Blades. She never married again, never settled. Just rode from injustice to injustice, collecting scars like offerings. But she didn't take glory, only retribution. And when she was finally captured, betrayed by a merchant she once saved, they hanged her in a town square. Her body swung for 3 days before a storm broke the rope. The townspeople found her corpse gone. Only the crows remained, feathers drifting in the mud. No one spoke her name aloud after that. Another kind of terrible. Made not from battlefields but from love lost turned to weapon. Not all warriors carried swords, some carried fire. There was once a man known only as the Plague Knight. He didn't fight for kings or causes, he fought for death. Covered head to toe in blackened chainmail, his face hidden by a mask shaped like a skull. They say he'd been a doctor once, a healer during one of the great plagues. He watched his entire town die, helpless. Cured no one, buried everyone. Afterwards, something in him cracked. He began to believe death was the only true healer, that mercy was too slow. So he picked up a mace and walked into war. Not to protect, not to conquer, but to balance the scales. He didn't speak, didn't eat where others ate. Slept standing, with his back to fire. He painted his armor with the ashes of the dead. Said it made him invisible to the angels of judgment. When he struck, it wasn't graceful. It was like a hammer falling from heaven. They say he once took on an entire regiment of holy knights, not out of hatred, just to see, to measure them. When it was over, only he remained. His armor steaming, the battlefield silent. And yet, he never touched innocence, never looted, never bragged. Just kept moving, like a shadow uninvited. Some called him cursed. Others called him necessary. And when he vanished one winter, leaving only a ring of burned grass where his tent had stood, no one followed, because everyone feared the answer to the question, what happens when death puts on armor? But not all terrors wore masks. Some smiled, some were charming. Some walked through courts and churches and abbeys with silk and scripture on their tongues and still left blood behind. There was a priest once, young, kind, loved by his congregation, until the war came, until his village was sacked by men who wore the wrong banner. They took everything, left him tied to a post with the bodies of his parishioners. When he was freed, something had changed. He took off the cloth, picked up a sword, but didn't stop there. He learned tactics, torture, strategy, became a general not for a nation but for vengeance. His army was made of ghosts, survivors, orphans, monks who burned their own books. They moved like smoke, striking at night, leaving behind messages carved into the bodies of the fallen. God sees. That was their creed. Not mercy, not penance, just judgment. The priest was known as the Inquisitor, but not for faith, for fury. He believed the world had failed its own commandments, and he appointed himself as its correction. His soldiers didn't take prisoners, didn't ask questions. They burned entire towns that refused to help, left coins stacked in towers beside the dead so the gods wouldn't forget their names. And yet, people followed him. Not because they believed, but because he made them feel safe in their fear. His sermons were like thunder, his blade like law. And when he was finally surrounded by royal armies, cornered on a hill outside a monastery, he didn't surrender. He turned to his men, said one sentence, "Let them feel our silence," and then charged. No one survived. But for years afterward, travelers claimed to see a figure in black standing outside burning churches, watching, never moving, just watching. Even ghosts, it seems, remember war. The Middle Ages were full of warriors like that. Not trained, not crowned, but born in a time where survival was a weapon. Where cruelty wasn't just a tool, it was the language of power. Some of the most terrifying knights weren't the strongest. They were the ones who understood that the mind breaks before the bone. The ones who stared too long, moved too still, smiled when they were cut. Once, a duke hired a man from the east. Said he had no name, only numbers tattooed down his spine. Said he never asked for payment, only permission. He came with 2 knives and a cloak that looked like dried blood. No one knew where he slept, or if he slept. But when the battles came, he moved like water over fire, never touched by arrows, never slowed by wounds. Some said he didn't breathe. And when the duke tried to dismiss him, fearful now of what he'd brought into his court, the warrior left without a word. But the duke's castle burned a month later. No gold taken, no bodies missing. Just every portrait in the hall scratched out at the eyes. Fear is an artist, and in the medieval world, it painted in blood. But the worst warriors, the truly terrible ones, weren't cruel. They were kind. That was the horror. That they believed they were doing good. That they smiled after killing. That they kissed their children's foreheads with the same hands that broke skulls. One such man was a knight in the service of a queen, known for peace. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, but on the field, he became something else. His armor was unmarked, his sword clean, his orders calm, but he never left anyone alive. He called it mercy, said survivors bred hatred. He was praised, given titles, land, statues, but the peasants never said his name, called him the Quiet. Said his horse never neighed, said his breath didn't fog. When he finally died, an old man in bed, they say the walls of his manor bled. Just once, just enough to stain the tapestries, he was buried with honors. But no one came to visit the grave, because even kindness, when wielded without question, becomes terrible. And now, here you are, breathing, safe, far from those battlefields. But the stories, they stay, because fear remembers, because war carves names even into silence, and some of those names are still waiting to be spoken again, not to glorify, not to summon, but to understand what happens when the world teaches us to be terrible just to survive. The night thickens. Outside your window, maybe there's only the hush of traffic or the rustle of leaves, but in your mind, we're still walking beside shadows, the kind that wore steel instead of smiles, the kind that made kings pause and made children listen to silence a little harder. We've met the forgotten warriors, the quiet monsters, the ones broken into power. But now, we begin to peel back the world that made them. Because the Middle Ages didn't just create warriors, it created reasons for them, patterns, systems, hunger that wore a crown, injustice that signed with wax and seal. And so we begin with a man who wasn't born cruel, but who learned that kindness gets buried under banners. He was a third son of a minor lord, no inheritance, no title, just a sword and a smile too sharp to be trusted. He was sent to war not because he wanted it, but because he had nowhere else to go. At first he fought because it was expected, swung his blade like Eve, wry other squire, flinched when the blood splashed, whispered prayers before sleeping. But war doesn't let you sleep, not for long. One night, his captain ordered them to burn a village, said the people were harboring rebels. They weren't. They were just poor. The young warrior hesitated, didn't swing, didn't light the torch, and the next day he found himself tied to a post, beaten, humiliated, and finally set free. Not because they forgave him, because they wanted him to learn. He did, but not what they thought. He learned that hesitation gets punished, that mercy isn't rewarded, that in war the only sin is being slow. He began to fight differently after that. Not angry, not even cold, just empty, efficient, precise. He kept a journal of the men he killed, not their names, just their faces, sketched by moonlight, hundreds of them. One day someone asked why. He said, "So I remember they were real." They called him the archivist, because he kept the past with him, but never let it slow his hand. In the end, he wasn't knighted. He refused the ceremony, said he didn't want to be remembered as a servant. Just a consequence. Another warrior, very different, was known across the steppes of the East. A girl born under a dying moon, raised by horsemen who believed the wind spoke prophecies. She was small, thin, unremarkable, until she wasn't. At 12, she rode into battle beside her father. At 14, she led raids. By 18, she commanded a force of nomads that cut through armies like wheat. She didn't fight with tradition. No armor, no banners, just speed, fire, and terror. Her warriors rode at dusk, arrows whistling like insects, faces painted with bone dust. They never attacked directly, they surrounded, confused, dissolved, returned. No one could predict them, no one could stop them. She became known as the Sandstorm, not because of her speed, but because of what she left behind. Nothing. No loot, no messages, just absence. Cities emptied, villages fled before her. Once, a prince offered her marriage, hoping to tame her. She accepted. The wedding was lavish, filled with gold, wine, and roses. She kissed him under a crescent moon, and by dawn, she was gone. The palace burned behind her. Every guest vanished. No one spoke her name again, only whispered, "The storm has eyes." That was the thing about medieval warfare. It didn't always reward strength. Sometimes, it rewarded unpredictability. And sometimes, unpredictability became legend. There was a man in the mountains, a blacksmith's apprentice, tall as a doorway, with arms like carved oak, but he didn't like violence. Preferred shaping iron, quiet mornings, the clang of hammer, and the hiss of water. But when his village was raided, when his wife was dragged behind horses, and his child thrown in a river, something in him broke. He didn't scream, didn't weep, just walked to his forge and began to build. Not tools, not armor, just a weapon. One single weapon. A sword too heavy for most men to lift. He spent weeks on it. Didn't speak, didn't sleep. When it was done, he tested it by cutting the raiders' camp in half, not metaphorically. He waited until night, walked in, said nothing, and didn't stop until every fire was out. His clothes soaked, his blade steaming. They say he carried that sword for years, never took gold, never joined a war, just roamed. If someone wronged the poor, he appeared. If a landlord beat a tenant, he knocked on the door. If a night grew cruel, he waited by the road. No one knew his name. Children called him the Anvil. Said if you heard metal on wind, you were already too late. But not all warriors were heroes in secret. Some were terrible because they enjoyed it, because the world shaped them into tools and they became blades without handles. One man, a mercenary born from famine, was known for never wearing armor. He said it slowed him down, said fear was the best shield. He'd charge into battle shirtless, covered in scars and red paint. He didn't speak during fights, only laughed. That laugh, high, sharp, wrong, became the sound soldiers feared most. He didn't lead armies, he joined them, broke them, left. He didn't care about sides, only challenge, only blood. He once fought a knight with a chained lion, killed the lion first, then the knight, then the crowd watching. No reason, just joy. People called him the butcher's joke, because he smiled like every death was a punchline, and the world couldn't stop him, because the world made him, gave him chaos, gave him cruelty, and he became what it needed, the worst of them. But the quietest warrior of this chapter was a boy who never spoke, ever. They thought he was mute, raised by monks, shunned by the others. But he watched, listened, learned. When invaders came, when the monastery burned, he picked up a broken sword. No training, no plan, just instinct. He fought, and didn't stop. They found him hours later, surrounded by bodies, breathing slow, blade still in hand. After that, he joined no army, but appeared at every siege, every desperate last stand. No one knew how he got there. He didn't speak, but he fought, and always walked away, unwounded, his face still boyish. Still unreadable. They called him the Echo, because he always came when no one else would. And when you asked who sent him, there was only silence. Terrible warriors were made by terrible times, but also by terrible choices. And the truth no one admits is this: they weren't all monsters. Some were trying to protect something. Some were trying to forget. Some were trying to make the pain mean something. And some just didn't know how to stop. Tonight, you're safe. You're not in a crumbling keep. You're not watching for banners on the horizon. But the stories they live, in us, around us, under the earth, etched into blades we can't see, waiting, not to be used, just to be remembered. The night stretches wider now, like a road with no end, and in the hush that follows every heartbeat, you can still hear them, the footfalls of warriors whose names were never carved in stone, but whose presence lingered in every creaking door, every firelit tale told beneath timber roofs. They weren't always great, they weren't always right, but they were terrible in the old sense of the word. Awe-filled, relentless, untamed. And now we walk a little further into the past, deeper into the shadows of that broken world where steel sang louder than prayer. Some warriors were born not from violence, but from duty. One such man was raised by a gravedigger. His life was quiet, predictable. Measure the wood, dig the hole, whisper a blessing even when no priest came. He believed in rest, in silence, until the king's men came. They took his father for conscription, took his land, took everything except the graves. He begged, said the dead deserved peace. They laughed, tore down markers, built barracks over bones. Something inside him snapped. He didn't scream, he didn't fight them then, he waited. That night, he unearthed an old blade buried with a knight long forgotten. Rusted, heavy, he cleaned it, prayed over it, named it only once, remembrance. Then he went to work. One by one, the soldiers vanished. Not with spectacle, but with care. A missing cloak, a blood smear in the snow, a boot in a tree. No one saw him, no one heard him, but they whispered, "The dead walk here." When the camp was empty, he rebuilt the graves, placed their weapons among the roots, spoke each name, even the cruel ones, and then he walked on. Not for vengeance, for balance. People began to call him the Grave Hand, because his justice was quiet and final. Then there was the knight who hated war. Truly, he was kind, gentle, loved poetry and music. But he was also a genius with a sword. Every duel he entered, he won. Every army he led, he crushed. And each time, he wept afterward. They say his blade was the cleanest in the kingdom, not from lack of use, but because he spent hours washing it, whispering apologies to the steel. He only killed when ordered, only followed the rules. And yet he killed more men than any other, because he was efficient, and because he obeyed. When asked why, he said, "I was told to." They made him a lord, a hero. A statue was carved with his likeness. But the people near his estate said he wandered at night, that he whispered to the crows, that his hands shook when he held a quill. One winter he vanished, left a letter. "I wanted to be kind, but they only valued my sword." That was the last anyone saw of him. They say in spring, roses grew around his empty scabbard like thorns, trying to undo the past. Not all warriors were made of muscle. Some were born from rot. One legend tells of a man who lived in a plague-struck city. No law, no bread, just sickness and desperation. He wore a mask, not to protect, but to hide the fact that he no longer felt fear. He learned to move through death like smoke. When war came, and no one would defend the town, he stood alone at the gate. Not to save them, but to prove that even the dying can be dangerous. He was covered in scars, his armor a patchwork of metal and cloth and bone. They say he never raised his voice. But when he swung, it was like thunder. The attackers fell, one by one, until they fled. The townspeople cheered, asked his name. He said nothing, just walked back into the disease, into the alleys no one dared enter, and kept going. They never saw him again. But stories of a masked figure defending plague villages began to surface across the land. Was he real? Maybe. Maybe not. But the fear was real, and fear shapes history more than truth ever could. One warrior came not from pain, but from perfection. A prince trained since birth. Every art, every tactic, every philosophy. He was flawless, handsome, sharp-eyed, and utterly without mercy. He believed the world should be shaped, not followed. That weakness was a failure of imagination. He didn't fight like others. He didn't react. He anticipated. He would low, okay at you and already know how you die. His soldiers loved him. His enemies feared him. But no one trusted him, because he never flinched, never hesitated, and never forgave. Once, an officer questioned an order. The prince smiled, invited him to a feast, toasted his courage, and poisoned his wine, slowly, publicly, without anger, without shame. His wars were brilliant, efficient, terrible. He wiped out rebellions before they began, turned allies against each other, won battles without fighting, and yet he kept a single wooden doll in his tent. Said it was his mother's. No one dared ask. When he died, they found journals, hundreds of them, detailing every battle, every death, every betrayal. But no regrets, only analysis. He wasn't a monster. He was a mirror of what happens when power is sharpened too well. Then there were the twins, a brother and sister raised by a traveling swordsman, orphaned at 10, trained in tandem. They moved like dancers, fought like shadows. One wore white, one wore black. No one ever saw them bleed. They didn't take jobs, they took causes. When a village was being bled dry by a corrupt bishop, they appeared. When children were being conscripted into war, they appeared. No pay, no words, just motion. They never stayed, never explained. Some said they were ghosts, others angels. But one old woman said they're what happens when grief is raised right. No one knows what became of them. One day, they just stopped appearing. But the stories remained. And the fear that if you harm the helpless, they'll find you. And you won't hear them coming. Fear. That's the thread running through all these tales. Not just fear of pain, but fear of justice that doesn't wear robes. Fear of retribution that doesn't knock. Some warriors were terrible, not because they loved war, but because they believed it was the only honest thing left. A knight who painted his armor with chalk before every battle said the white was for the bones of the innocent, that when it cracked, they could see through him. He rode alone, refused command, refused praise. After each fight, he buried the fallen. Both sides, even in frost, even under arrows. Once a commander asked him why. He said, "Because I remember what it's like to be left behind." No one asked again. He died on a battlefield no one marked. But months later, flowers grew in the shape of his blade, and the soil stayed soft, like someone had never stopped digging. The medieval world didn't give medals for kindness. It gave survival to those who could carry guilt like armor, who turned sorrow into swordplay, and who knew, deep down, that the line between good and terrible was drawn in shifting ash. So rest now. You're not there. You're not fighting. But somewhere in your breath is the echo of steel, of footsteps, of names once feared. Not because they were evil, but because they couldn't be ignored. You're still awake. Or maybe your eyes are closed, and your mind floats somewhere between thought and dream. That's okay. You don't have to hold on to every name, every sword, every sorrow. The stories will stay. They've lived for centuries in the gaps between silence and firelight. And tonight, they breathe again. Not to glorify war, but to remember the shape of survival. We've walked with warriors forged by loss, by duty, by cruelty. But now we step deeper, into the places where terrible meant something sacred. Not in cruelty, but in conviction. There was once a nun who was not always a nun. Her youth was spent in chains. A prisoner of war, passed between camps like a relic no one respected. She should have broken. Most did. But she watched, listened, waited. She learned the weakness in voices, the patterns of patrols, the silence that comes before an executioner's blade. One night during a storm, she escaped, with nothing, no shoes, no food. Just a shard of broken pottery sharpened on stone. She crossed forests, rivers, war zones. By the time she reached a monastery, she was more specter than woman. They took her in, fed her, clothed her, and she stayed, for years, quiet, devoted. Until war came again, until the monastery was threatened. She didn't pray. She packed, found her old shard, now wrapped in cloth, asked for the black robe of a mourning nun, then left. They say she moved like rain on rooftops, soft, relentless, deadly. She didn't carry a sword. She carried needles, vials, herbs, poisons that sang like lullabies. She wasn't loud, but everywhere she passed, commanders fell. Slowly, painfully, with confusion on their lips, her legend spread as a whisper. The Sister of Thorns. Mothers warned their sons not to raise arms near churches. Soldiers crossed themselves twice. And when she died, it wasn't in battle. It was in bed, peacefully, surrounded by blooming roses no one had planted. Her legacy wasn't vengeance. It was precision, and proof that even those broken by war can become its sharpest edge. Another warrior, very different, was a jester. Truly. He was born into a royal court, trained to make nobles laugh, to juggle, to somersault through their apathy. But he watched them, saw the cracks in their games, understood their fears. One day, during an invasion, while the king cowered, the jester picked up a spear. No one stopped him, because no one expected him to return. But he did, bloody, breathing, alone, with 3 enemy blades tied to his belt like bells. He laughed when he threw them down, but it wasn't joy. It was release. After that, he refused his old clothes, painted his face white, carried a lute with a hidden blade in its spine. He traveled across kingdoms, performing by day, hunting by night. Not soldiers, traitors, cowards, kings who ran from war and sent peasants to die. He'd sing them lullabies, then leave them with ink on their chests. The fool remembers. He became myth, the laughing blade. Some said he danced with ghosts, others said he was a ghost. But every time a noble vanished, a song was heard the night before, one no one could forget. There was a woman who trained herself in silence, not because she wanted to, but because her voice had been stolen, her village attacked, her throat cut. She survived, but sound never returned. So she used her body, taught herself to move like wind through wheat. At night she practiced alone with broken broomsticks, turning pain into rhythm. When soldiers returned to burn what was left, she didn't scream. She moved, swift, brutal, unafraid, and when they died, no one heard it. From then on, she wore only gray. Her weapon was a staff of ashwood, her hair braided with twine. She defended roads, monasteries, orphan houses, but she never spoke. They say if you wronged the helpless and then heard only wind, it was already too late. Her silence became her name, the Hushed. Children left flowers in her path. Even soldiers bowed as she passed. Not from fear, but reverence. Because sometimes the most terrible warriors aren't cruel. They're kind, but with no more room for forgiveness. In the forests near the borderlands, there lived a man with no hands. They had been taken by slavers, but he didn't die. He learned to fight with his legs, with ropes, with teeth. He built weapons that strapped to his stumps hooks, spikes, short blades. He moved like an animal, fast, brutal, precise. The slavers who returned never left, and when others heard, they sought him out. Survivors, outcasts, broken men who still breathed but didn't believe they mattered. He trained them, not with words, with eyes, with pain. They formed a band that defended no lands, only people. They refused gold, burned every flag. They called themselves the Unclaimed. And their leader? They called him the Maw. Because when he bit, he didn't let go. Not every warrior was tragic. Some were joyous, and still terrible. One was a baker's daughter, bright-eyed, clever. She learned to fight from watching mercenaries drink in her father's inn, mimicked their stances, practiced with rolling pins. One day, a warlord attacked the town, demanded submission. She laughed, challenged him to a duel. He accepted amused. She broke his jaw in 5 strikes. And just like that, became leader of the town's defense. She trained farmers, children, old men, turned them into fighters. They won, over and over, because they fought with belief, with humor, with love. But when enemies saw her smile, they flinched, because it meant she saw a weakness, and she always struck where it hurt. They called her the Flower Knight. And yes, she wore white, covered in ash and dough, but her blade was clean, always clean. Then there were the twins who weren't human, or maybe they were. No one knew. They appeared during famines, during sieges, during hopelessness, covered in rags. One carried a flute, one carried a knife. They said nothing, just stood near gates until let inside. And once inside, miracles. Poisoned wells ran Clell, R. Enemy commanders fell in their tents. Siege ladders broke before dawn. No one saw them act. No one knew their names. But after they left, crops grew again. Children laughed. And the town remembered. Not with fear, with awe, with unease. Because no one knew why they helped, or what they wanted. Just that when they looked at you, it felt like being weighed, not judged, measured. Terrible warriors aren't always loud. They aren't always men. They aren't always right. But they exist in every history, because they are the answer to a world that forgets kindness, that forgets mercy. And so kindness learns to sharpen its edge, mercy learns to aim, and warriors are born, not to conquer, but to correct. Tonight, as your body sinks into the weight of the blanket, as your eyes drift somewhere between breath and memory, remember this. Fear teaches, but so does survival. And somewhere in you, far beneath the surface, is a story older than your name. One where you carried something heavier than steel and chose not to drop it. That's what these warriors did, and that's why we still whisper them. Not because we want to be like them, but because we hope we never have to be. The night has deepened into that sacred stillness where time begins to forget itself, and the breath you draw feels like something older than your lungs. You've heard so many names, so many swords, so many stories shaped not by glory but by necessity. And now, as we begin a new chapter, we shift our gaze from the battlefield to the world that built it, from blood on the blade to the fingers that first gripped the hilt. Because terrible warriors were not born in the middle of war. They were forged long before it, in quiet kitchens, in crowded stables, in prisons no one wrote about. There was once a boy whose mother was executed for stealing a loaf of bread. He was 7. He watched it happen. She said nothing, just held his eyes until the rope took her breath. After that, he stopped speaking. Grew up in workhouses, learned to move without being noticed, to eat fast, to hide faster. By 15, he was part of a gang that robbed nobles on forest roads. But he didn't steal for gold. He took books, maps, knives. He taught himself. Trained in abandoned ruins with ghosts for company. And then, slowly, methodically, he began to kill. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for balance. He chose his targets carefully: men who abused servants, who burned fields for fun, who hunted peasants like game. He made their deaths look like accidents, or worse, like omens. When one baron was found drowned in a trough with coins stuffed into his mouth, rumors spread. The ragman, they called him, because he wore only patched cloth, no armor, no banners, no fear. The king sent knights to find him. None returned, but every time one vanished, a piece of bread would appear at the city gates, wrapped in gray linen, a reminder of hunger, of debt, of memory. There was a woman raised in a brothel, not a noble one, the kind built in shadows, behind taverns that stank of spilled wine and unspoken names. She learned early that words were weapons, but she preferred knives. She watched the guards, watched the drunk men, watched the way their bodies moved. She began training with razors, hiding them in her hair, her boots, the folds of her sleeves. At 17, she killed a man who tried to take her sister. Left his body in the square with a flower between his teeth. Then she vanished, but not far. She stayed in cities, posing as a servant, a maid, a midwife, always near power, always listening. When the time was right, she struck. One by one, corrupt officials died. Some in bed, some in bathhouses, some on the steps of the very temples they defiled. No one ever saw her. But each time, a white ribbon was left tied to the victim's wrist. She became known as the seamstress, and every noble feared the whisper of silk. Not every warrior sought death. Some walked beside it, gently. There was an old man who once served as a cook in an army. No one knew his name, just that he was kind, that he sang to himself while stirring pots, that he had eyes like smoke. But one day, when the camp was attacked and the soldiers fled, he did not. He stood between the invaders and the infirmary, with a butcher's cleaver. No armor, no plan, just stillness. They laughed. They stopped laughing after the first died. He moved like water. No wasted motion, no sound. The survivors said it felt like the wind turned against them. After that, he never returned to the kitchen, just kept walking. From field to field, from army to army, helping the wounded, feeding the poor. And when danger came, he stood, always. Some called him Saint Cleaver. Others said he was death's servant, but no one touched him, not even the enemy. Because something in his eyes said, I've already buried more than you can count. Then there were those who wanted no legend, no memory, just silence. One knight wore no crest, no colors. His More was gray with soot, his horse silent as fog. He fought only in wars that had no purpose, the ones where farmers were conscripted for land they'd never see, where taxes paid for blood. He'd arrive, say nothing, fight, and leave, but never with joy, with weight. They say he buried the dead himself, even the ones he'd slain. He carried a shovel tied to his saddle, not for show, for penance. Once, a general asked him who he served. The knight pointed to a field of graves. Them. That's all he said. That's all he ever said. The people called him the Morning Blade, because he never raised his sword without closing his eyes first. There was a boy raised by thieves, taught to lie, taught to steal, but he was different. He loved poetry, sang to himself while picking locks. The others laughed, until the war came, and the soldiers came, and they started dying, one by one, their throats slit, their chests carved with verses, rhyming couplets about justice and fire. It was him, the singing boy. He'd become something else, a poet of pain. He wrote his kills and stanzas, left scrolls beside the bodies. People feared the words more than the blade, because they were beautiful and true and cruel. He became known as the Lyrical. Bards refused to sing in towns where he walked, but secretly they memorized every line. Because some warriors don't fight with steel, they fight with truth, and that too can bleed. In the mountains, a girl lived with wolves, not raised by them, but guided. She watched how they moved, how they hunted, how they mourned. She trained herself in snow and stone, learned to throw blades from behind trees, to run without sound. When raiders came, she didn't warn the village. She waited, then hunted them one by one. Her kills were methodical, animal, clean. Afterward, she never returned. She lived in the woods, but travelers claimed to see her shadow at night, watching, guarding. The villagers left meat by the edge of the trees each winter, in thanks and in fear. They called her Frost, not because she was cold, but because she was everywhere the light didn't reach. You see, terrible doesn't always mean evil. It means unstoppable. It means unforgettable. It means something forged in heat but cooled in silence. As you lie there, with your eyes heavy, know this. The warriors you've heard about tonight weren't saints, weren't myths. They were people, with breath, with memory, with reasons. Some of them wanted peace. Some wanted revenge. Some didn't know what they wanted, only that the world kept demanding more from them than it gave. And so they became something else. A blade, a shadow, a whisper. You don't have to remember every name. Just know they walked here and left behind echoes that still shape the ground beneath your dreams. Somewhere beyond the hush of your room and the softness of your breath, a different world still waits, a world where snow fell black with ash, where swords hummed through the mist like angry prayers, and where the most terrifying figures were not monsters, but men and women who no longer needed reasons to act. As we step deeper into the silence of this story, we do not seek noise or shock, we seek memory. Because in the long shadow of the Middle Ages, the terrible were often the forgotten, and what is forgotten doesn't rest, it whispers. There once was a monastery high in the cliffs that held no books, no relics, no gold, only questions. Its monks trained not in scripture, but in silence, in balance, in movement. They spoke only once a year. They believed that clarity came from stillness, that the body, sharpened by repetition, could become an answer. And among them was one who never spoke, not even on the chosen day. He was called Ash. His eyes were gray, his movements slow and perfect. When war reached the mountain and the monastery was burned, Ash survived, and what emerged was not vengeance. It was rhythm. He did not join armies, he did not offer names. But across decades, rumors spread of a man in tattered robes who appeared in the worst battles, walking calmly through chaos, ending fights with movements so quiet they looked like breath. He didn't kill with anger. He killed because someone had to. No one ever thanked him, and no one ever stopped him. There was a knight who refused to die, literally. He had been pierced, drowned, burned. And yet each time, he rose again. Some said he had made a pact. Others believed he had no soul. But he remembered every pain, every scar. He wrote them down on his skin in ink, his body a map of horror. He fought not with joy, but exhaustion. And each kill made his steps heavier, not lighter. He was feared not because he was strong, but because he would not stop. Entire armies surrendered at his approach, because no one wants to fight what cannot fall. In the coldest corner of the world, there lived a woman with no name. She walked barefoot through snow, carried a sword longer than her body. Her armor was fur, blood, and patience. She did poets speak the language of kings. She did not bow. But when she fought, the earth itself seemed to flinch. She once defended a village for no pay. When asked why, she pointed to a child holding a stick. "Because he stood," she said. Her voice cracked like ice. After the war, she left, wandered, never accepted reward, only bread. Her legend became the stuff of lullabies, but not soothing ones. The kind sung to keep children from becoming cruel. In the far deserts, a warrior was raised by shadows. He was blind, but saw more than most. Trained in sound, scent, heat. His blades were curved, light, and rang when they met air. He could fight with wind behind him, could disarm without touching. His enemies mocked him until he moved. Then they never mocked again. His reputation spread beyond borders. He was offered titles, thrones. He refused, said power needed vision. And he had already seen too much. There was a healer who turned to war after losing too many patients. He believed that pain was not natural, that suffering was a failure of care. But when war took his village, he stopped believing. He strapped knives to his arms, herbs to his chest, and vengeance to his breath. He killed only those who harmed the helpless. But his methods were surgical, clean, unemotional. He called it treatment. The world called him the surgeon. He was not warm, but he saved more lives than any noble. A soldier once fought using only shields, refused to carry blades. He believed destruction was weakness, that real power came from protection. His shields were massive, scarred, and heavy. But when he moved, it was like stone sliding through rain. He stood in front of villages, temples, children, and he never broke. Arrows snapped against him, fire washed over him. But his stance remained. He never spoke of victory, only held the line. When he finally fell, his body was found with arms outstretched, still standing, frozen in ice, facing the enemy. They built a chapel around him, no words on the walls, just a door made of old shields. Some warriors never held weapons at all. One was a singer. Her voice could still rooms, but her songs were of injustice, of blood, of names erased. She traveled across kingdoms, performed for kings, then disappeared the next morning, leaving behind broken alliances, generals hanged by their own men, revolutions whispered by those who'd heard her melody. They said her voice could bend iron, or at least hearts. And what bends can break. Her name? No one knows. Only that her songs always ended with the same line. You remember now. There was a warrior who only killed in sleep, not out of cruelty, out of mercy. He believed battle was suffering, that death should be swift and without fear. He moved through camps like fog, gently pressing daggers into those who tortured, who burned, who stole. None ever woke. He was never seen. But when dawn came and certain men didn't rise, soldiers would whisper thanks instead of prayers. Because sometimes terrible warriors do not roar. They cradle death in soft hands and teach it to whisper. A prince who hated royalty gave up his title and went to live among the poor. But he took with him knowledge of tactics, of power, of corruption. He taught the villages how to resist, how to move, how to mislead armies. His war was not of blades, but of fire and rumor. The nobles called him a terrorist. The people called him the lantern, because he brought light into places no one wanted to see. And he burned for it. When he died, 1,000 candles were lit across the land, and the flames never went out. You see, the worst warriors in history were not those who destroyed the most. They were the ones who could not be stopped. Because their war wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in memory, in silence, in the spaces where cruelty hides. As you drift deeper now, wrapped in the soft shield of your blanket, know that sleep is not forgetting, it is remembering differently. These warriors you've met, they were not perfect, they were not kind, but they were necessary. And their stories live not in books, but in the part of your heart that still flinches when the world turns dark. Rest now, you are safe. But the terrible still walk in dreams, not to frighten you, but to remind you, survival is also a kind of blade. The deeper into the night we go, the softer the sounds become, until even your breath seems to echo off the walls of centuries past, brushing up against stories not written in ink, but in the silence between screams. These were the warriors history couldn't forget, not because they wanted to be remembered, but because the world had to invent cautionary tales for the kind of pain they left behind. You've met the ones who moved through fire and snow, who shaped themselves into shadows or songs. But there were others quieter, stranger, more unsettling. Some didn't look like warriors at all. One was a shepherd, soft-voiced, tender-eyed. He lived alone in the hills and spoke more to his sheep than to people. But when raiders came and burned his flock alive for sport, he changed. He took their bones and carved them into knives. He covered himself in their ashes. And then he waited. Not in anger, in patience. The next time raiders came, they vanished. Whole groups, no blood, no struggle, just silence. It wasn't until years later that travelers began finding bones arranged in spiral patterns in the meadows, white bones, cleaned and stacked, always facing east. The shepherd never spoke of it, just returned to his hills and watched. Another was a child, barely 10. His village destroyed by a feudal dispute. His parents burned alive. He should have died too, but he hid in the roots of an old tree for days. When he emerged, he didn't cry. He wondered, found a group of deserters, followed them silently. They tried to send him away. Then they tried to beat him. But every time one slept, he found a way to steal their weapon and hide it, until they had none, until they begged. Then he left, but not far. He followed armies, studied formations, picked up dropped scrolls. Eventually, he learned how battles worked, and he sabotaged them. Quietly. Dams broke before sieges. Food spoiled, horses spooked. People began to blame ghosts. But it was him, the barefoot boy with no name. When he was finally caught and brought before a general, he said only one thing. I learned from watching you. The general retired the next day. In the far north, there was a woman who wore only feathers. Not clothing made of feathers, just feathers, glued to her skin with resin and blood. She never spoke, only screamed, a piercing scream that made men drop weapons and cry for their mothers. She fought with a curved blade and a stone hammer, fast, brutal, laughing. But the laughter wasn't joy, it was brokenness made audible. Her enemies feared her madness more than her steel. Some claimed she was a witch, others a demon. But one hunter who survived said this, she was not mad, she was awake, and the rest of us were still pretending. A former priest once became a warlord, not for power, but because he believed God had stopped listening. He said the only justice left was the kind written in wounds. His army wore no uniforms, only black paint smeared across their faces. They didn't shout, didn't cheer. They fought like whispers, each strike a sermon. He called them the choir, and before every battle, he read from a book that contained no words, just blank pages. This, he would say, is what faith has become. Then he would close it and begin. There was a woman known only as the candle. She moved only at night. Her armor was reflective, so when the moon hit her, she seemed to glow. She never killed, but she paralyzed, poisoned, disarmed. And then she left a single candle burning at the scene. No one ever saw her face, but rumors said her skin bore brands from 8 different prisons, that she had been hanged once. and survived. She appeared wherever the law had failed and disappeared before anyone could thank her. Her legacy was fear, but a grateful fear. A reminder that someone still watched when the courts didn't. In the drowned marshlands of the South, there was a man who never stood upright. His spine bent from birth, his legs twisted. But his arms were strong, and his mind sharper than any dagger. He created traps, devices, mechanical horrors that crushed bones without warning. He defended his village for 40 years. No soldier ever stepped foot into his marsh without disappearing. He never spoke to outsiders, never asked for help. When the king sent envoys, he sent back their horses alive, but with carvings in their hooves that read, "Turn back." The marsh became known as the Crooked Border, and no one crossed it again. A wandering blacksmith once built weapons so perfect they never missed. Arrows that curved in flight, blades that sang, spears that pierced even plate. But he only gave them to the broken-hearted, those who had lost everything. He wandered from town to town asking one question: who do you love most? And if the answer made him weep, he gifted his tools. Every time one of his weapons was used, it vanished. After the kill, no one knew how, but everyone believed it was the soul returning to the forge. Some warriors were not born of pain or purpose. They were born because the world made no sense, and they refused to accept that. A child in a monastery once asked why kings were allowed to kill. The monks gave no answer. So he left, became a highwayman. But instead of gold, he took books. He built a library deep in a cave, guarded by puzzles and traps. Every soldier who tried to seize it disappeared. But every poor traveler who sought knowledge returned wiser. He believed ideas were weapons, and ignorance the real enemy. The sword he carried had no edge, just symbols. But he held it like fire, and the world flinched when he raised it. One warrior was never seen, only heard, a flute in the night, soft, sad. And wherever it played, the cruelest among men vanished. It began near mines where workers were whipped. Then moved to castles where daughters were sold. Then into cities where laughter cost coin. Each time a melody, each time a body missing. Eventually, people began leaving coins and flowers on windowsills, hoping the flute would pass by and spare them. No one ever saw who played it, but every note was a warning. I am watching. I am listening. I do not forget, and neither will you. So here you are now, surrounded by the weight of countless footsteps, by stories folded into the folds of history's cloak. You may not remember each name. That's okay. These warriors didn't want fame. They wanted change. They didn't ask to be sung. They just wanted the screaming to stop. As you drift into sleep now, hear them not as monsters or heroes, but as echoes, as warnings, as questions. Because for every terrible warrior who walked this earth, there were 100 silent ones staring at the firelight, wondering how much more they'd have to carry before the world became quiet again. Rest easy. You are not them. But in your quiet heart, their rhythm still beats. Welcome back to the space between silence and memory, where the footsteps of the forgotten still echo in the dark corners of the mind, and the stillness of night becomes a stage for old shadows to dance again. If your eyes are closed now, that's good. Let the shapes form behind your lids without clarity. You do not need to see to understand. You only need to listen. We've walked through the stories of those who did not ask to be remembered, who became terrible not by choice but by circumstance. Now, in this chapter, we descend even further into the strange, into those places where warrior and myth begin to blur, where the terrible becomes not just a word but a presence. Let us begin with a soldier who had died once and decided not to stay that way. His name was Baron. He fell during a siege, pierced with arrows, left in the mud with the others. But when the enemy retreated, the bodies were burned, and Baron did not burn. He rose from the pile, skin blackened, eyes red, but breath still rattling in his chest. He never returned home. He walked instead. His armor melted and reshaped into jagged plates. He spoke to no one, But wherever he passed, men who had once committed atrocities died in their sleep, faces twisted, mouths full of ash. They say he wasn't seeking revenge, he was seeking weight, a balance. They called him the Ember Knight. And when winter came, his steps melted snow. Then there was a girl raised by executioners. She saw heads roll before she saw birds fly. Her lullabies were the sound of axes on wood, but she was quiet. Gentle, she fed the condemned their last meals with care, and when she came of age, she refused to become a killer. Instead, she took a vow she would stop executions, all of them, but not with petitions or pleas, with fear. She learned to disable without death. Her twin blades could shatter bone without piercing skin. She fought not to kill, but to prove a point. You can be terrifying without ending a life. Soon, entire provinces stopped public executions. Not because they became more merciful, but because they feared the whisper axe. Then came the story of a former queen who disappeared after her castle fell. Her husband dead, her crown gone. Rumors said she fled to a convent. But in truth, she trained herself in secrecy. She studied poisons, learned languages, bought information, and began dismantling the empire that betrayed her not with war, but with rumors, with lost treaties, with whispered betrayals. Cities fell without a single blade raised. Economies crumbled. Nobles vanished. They called her the Widow Flame, because you never saw her coming, only the smoke she left behind. In the forests of the West, a man known only as Root lived in the hollows of dead trees. He never bathed, never spoke. His beard was moss, his eyes amber. Hunters mocked him until they stopped returning. When villagers ventured close, they found signs, piles of animal bones arranged in warning patterns, strange symbols burned into bark, trees bleeding sap-shaped lie, key faces. Root didn't fight battles. He protected something older, deeper. Some believed he was the forest's revenge. Others claimed he once was a healer who lost too much. Either way, he was terrible in the way that nature is quiet, patient, and absolute. Another warrior had no limbs. A plague had taken them. But he didn't die. He trained his mind, directed others, built a fortress without bricks, only people. He turned orphans into spies, beggars into saboteurs. He created a network so vast, kings fell without knowing why. He sat in a wheeled throne, blindfolded, never raising his voice. He spoke only in riddles, and yet every riddle was a strategy. Every phrase, a death sentence. His name was Dust King, and though he never held a sword, entire nations bled from his words. In the southern canyons, a tribe believed in war dances, movements passed down through blood. Their greatest warrior was a woman who had no tribe, only rhythm. She moved with a grace that made killing look like art. Her spear spun like wind, her feet never touched the same stone twice. When she fought, flutes played. Not real ones, but those who watched swore they heard music. She fought only when someone disrespected the land, and when she won, she danced for the dead. Even enemies, especially enemies. Her name was Feather Fall, and her presence made even fire forget how to burn. Then there was the Iron Servant, a man who believed he was already dead. He had once been a scribe, captured, tortured, left in chains so long he forgot his name. But he remembered stories. He escaped, covered himself in iron bands, not armor, shackles, reminders. He never removed them. They clanked when he moved, and when he fought, the sound drove men mad. He said nothing, only stared. They say if he ever looked at you and turned away, you were already lost. In ruined cities, his chains still echo in alleys, and mothers tell their children, "Be kind, or the Iron Servant will return." One young girl had no family, raised in a monastery. But the monks were cruel. They taught silence with bruises, devotion with starvation. One night, she snapped, but not loudly. She began slipping bitter roots into the monks' tea. One by one, they lost speech, then sight, then thought. She left with no one to stop her. and built her own order, one that believed kindness was louder than prayer. She trained warriors not to fight, but to shield. And yet, she herself fought with a rope long, silken, braided from old habits. They called her the Scarlet Loop, and no blade ever reached her skin. These were the terrible not born of anger but of clarity. They saw the world for what it was, and chose not to become it, but something worse, or better, depending on which side you stood. And now, as your mind sinks deeper into this strange softness, this warm weight of not quite sleep, know this: the most dangerous warriors didn't raise swords, they raised questions. About what we allow, about what we become when we stop listening. Their stories may be gone from books, but not from bone, not from breath, not from the part of you that still hopes for justice in the quiet. Sleep now. You are not alone. The terrible walk with you, not to harm you, but to remind you, even in darkness, there were those who chose to become fire. The night carries you gently now, like a forgotten letter folded into the sleeve of time, its message unread but felt in every line, every breath. The world outside has grown quieter, not because it has stopped, but because you've moved beneath its surface, into the deeper chambers of silence where stories continue breathing long after their tellers have vanished. And in this part of the journey, we visit not the battlefield, not the throne room, but the places in between the crossroads where history blurs and the most terrible warriors slip in unnoticed. There was a man with no face. Not that it was hidden he had no features. Just smooth flesh stretched over bone. It was said he lost his face to a curse, or to fire, or because he had betrayed a god. No one knew. But when he came, people ran. Not because he was monstrous, but because he moved like a memory half formed, half feared. He carried a mirror on his chest, and those who dared to look into it saw not their reflection, but the last person they failed to protect. He didn't fight. He just stood, and people broke themselves trying to escape the past. His presence became a myth used to keep warriors humble. Do good, they'd say, or the Mirror Man will find you. Deep beneath the city, where catacombs tangled like veins beneath skin, a boy lived among the bones. His family had been buried there, forgotten by time. But he stayed, made a life from the silence, listened to the whispers of decay, and in time he understood them. He could read the patterns of rot, predict collapse, feel echoes in stone. When war came to the city, he emerged, guided rebels through tunnels, collapsed bridges under marching boots. He never saw the S, but the sun felt him. They called him the Root Walker, because he moved where no one else dared, and wherever he stepped, empires cracked. There was a woman who never stepped into shadow, not once. She believed darkness was where lies hid, and so she lived always in light. She wore reflective glass, draped her home in mirrors, and fought only in daylight. Her blade was polished to blinding shine, her shield a disk of sun. But her terror came not from weapons, it came from exposure. She forced her enemies to see themselves. Her attacks mirrored their own. She showed them what they had done, what they had become. Many dropped their swords before the first strike. She didn't kill, she revealed. And sometimes that was worse. They called her Halo, but not with reverence, with fear. On the coasts, there was an old sailor who hadn't spoken in 30 years. His ship had gone down in a storm, crew lost, only he survived. But something came back with him. He walked the docks in silence, carried a harpoon stained black with salt. When pirates raided the port, he didn't raise alarms. He walked straight into their ship. 1 hour later, it drifted ashore, empty, its sails torn, its deck soaked, not in blood, but in seawater that smelled like graves. The harpoon was planted in the mast, splitting it, and the sailor was never seen again. Locals say he became tide itself, the sea's revenge, forever watching. His name was never known, just a whisper, the undertow. In distant valleys where frost never melted, a pair of twins lived in silence. One spoke only in dreams, the other only in riddles. Together, they trained with nets and needles, tools of entanglement, not death. But when invaders came, they trapped them, Not in cages, but in confusion. Whole battalions wandered forests that weren't there. Roads bent back on themselves. Time looped. The twins were never seen in the same place twice, and those who survived swore they had spoken to their mother, their child, themselves. No one knows what became of the twins. But the valley has no roads now, just snow, and the memory of questions with no answers. There was a smith who forged armor not for war but for emotion, helmets that amplified grief, breastplates that mirrored regret, gauntlets that made your hands feel heavy with every wrong you'd done. He gave them to kings and watched them crumble. His goal was not death, it was awakening. He believed the only terrible warrior worth fearing was the one who understood the weight of what they carried. One king went mad wearing his suit. Another wept for 3 days and then disbanded his army. The smith disappeared afterward. Some say he melted himself into one of his own suits. Others say he lives still, walking quietly through villages, pressing iron into the hands of tyrants and waiting. There was a boy born without the ability to feel fear. He climbed towers before he could walk, stood on battlements in storms. As he grew, he took jobs others wouldn't. Guarding tombs, watching plague pits, fighting alone, he survived everything. Not because he was stronger, but because he didn't flinch. His calm unnerved enemies. His stillness made even monsters pause. They say one day he walked into a cursed forest where no man had returned. But he did, carrying something wrapped in cloth. No one knows what it was, but after that, he smiled. Once, just once. They called him the Pale Flame, because fear never touched him, but something else did. Far to the east, a dancer became a killer, not because she wanted revenge, but because her sister had disappeared. She followed clues in performances, in songs, in strange stage posters left behind. The trail led her into dens of cruelty. She infiltrated them as a performer. Danse hypnotized. And in that trance, she struck. Fast, lethal, silent. She didn't kill all, only those who watched cruelty and did nothing. Her stage became sacred, her blade an encore. They say if you see a red ribbon on a theater door, don't go inside. Not unless your conscience is clean. The worst warriors didn't brag, didn't parade. They walked alone, not because they were exiled, but because company made the world harder to carry. You see, each of these terrible ones carried not weapons, but weight. Their pasts were sharpened into purpose, their wounds molded into maps. And as you drift now, deeper into the still warmth of sleep, let that idea linger, that the worst warriors in history weren't made of rage, but of memory, of choices repeated, of silence finally shattered. You are safe here, but the terrible do not rest. They keep walking somewhere in the fog between dream and myth, to remind the world what happens when the forgotten finally speak. You're further now, deeper than you think, in that velvet space where time lets go of your wrist and memory floats weightless through your mind. The world above may still spin, but down here, in the layers between thought and rest, stories take shape not to be remembered, but simply to be felt. This part of our journey belongs to those warriors who did not fight for lands or kings or glory. They fought for things quieter, stranger, things that have no name, only consequence. There was once a woman known only as the Quiet. She had no weapons, no armor, no army. But her presence alone turned war to frost. She walked into battlefields after the fighting was done and stood beside the fallen, whispering their names, whether friend or foe. And somehow, those names echoed back into the ears of those still alive, waking them with tears they didn't understand. Armies that had seen her never fought again. She was feared by generals, not for violence, but because she could end campaigns with a glance. Her power was not in killing, but in stopping others from wanting to. They say she still walks war grounds, barefoot, and where she steps, grass grows no more. Another warrior lived beneath the mountain, literally. A man who had once been a tunneler for a corrupt noble who buried people alive as punishment. When the man discovered this horror, he refused to flee. Instead, he stayed, dug deeper, built a labyrinth beneath the prison. One by one, he rescued the condemned, guiding them through impossible tunnels and sealing the exits behind them. Eventually, the noble discovered the treachery and collapsed the mountain. But the man survived, and for years afterward, any prisoner who disappeared without a trace was said to have been taken by the digger. His tunnels became legend. Some believed he was made of stone, others that he had fused with the mountain, but all agreed. You did not trap justice without consequences. Far across the frozen steppes, there was a boy who couldn't speak, couldn't hear, but saw more than any scout. He read lips from miles away, felt vibration in snow, interpreted wind. He became the eyes of a tribe on the brink of extinction, taught them how to move, when to vanish, where to strike. He never held a weapon, but his gestures, clear, precise, saved hundreds. They called him the Snow Signal. And when invaders finally came, they found an empty camp, footsteps swallowed by snow, and the wind whispering warnings in a language no one could translate. A terrible warrior doesn't always need blades. Sometimes, they just need clarity. In a drowned kingdom, where cathedrals sank into salt and memory, there was a girl who refused to forget. She memorized every name written on lost tombs, every prayer carved into cracked bells. She wove them into song low, haunting, sung to the rhythm of tides. Her voice reached across waters, into enemy ships, into the ears of kings who had destroyed her home, and they began to dream. Nightmares, faces of those they'd buried, words they couldn't understand, but felt anyway. The girl never left the shore, but her song pulled ships apart, turned oceans against armies. They called her the Bell Siren. And even now, when storms gather, sailors hear a melody beneath the thunder and remember who they left behind. A smith once built a machine not of gears, but of bones. Not to kill, to remember. Every warrior who came to him brought something, a tooth, a finger bone, a shard, and the smith would place it into the great wheel. When it turned, it would whisper the names of the fallen. No one knew how, but the sound broke men's hearts. Before every battle, armies gathered to listen, and often they walked away. The smith was not feared because he caused pain, but because he reminded people of the pain they caused. Eventually, the machine was buried, too heavy to carry. But sometimes, when wind hits the valley just right, you can hear it turning. In a monastery carved into cliffside lived a man who walked backward. Always, since childhood, he believed the world only moved forward when someone remembered to look behind. He trained in reverse fighting mirroring attacks, stepping where others fled. His body moved like film play, backward. Enemies couldn't predict him. His victories were elegant, clean, but his eyes were tired. He saw the future in fragments, and none of them were kind. They called him the Echo Monk. And after each battle, he wept. Not for the fallen, for what was coming next. A queen once ruled without armies. Her weapon was mercy. But not soft mercy, the hard kind. The kind that forced people to face their guilt. She forgave murderers, but made them serve the families of their victims. She freed traitors, but branded their arms so they'd never forget. Her justice was radical, uncomfortable, terrifying. Nobles tried to assassinate her, but every blade turned away. Some say she was protected by spirits. Others say her conscience was armor. Either way, her reign was short, but no one forgot her. They called her the Iron Dove, because she flew only through storms. Deep in a forest that no map held, a child lived among wolves. Not raised by them, respected by them. She moved like wind through branches, learned to bite before she learned to speak. When loggers came to take the trees, she warned them once, then disappeared. The next day, their axes rusted overnight. Their fires turned to smoke. Their paths bent back toward their homes. They fled. She never touched them. But every night, one would dream of yellow eyes and wake screaming. Her name became taboo. But the forest grew tall. The most terrible warriors are not those who take most lives. They're the ones who change how others live. As you settle further now, your breath deepening, your limbs heavier, remember this: These stories are not meant to frighten, they are meant to shift, to remind that even in the darkest pages of history, there were those who stood not for power, but for something quieter, for the right to not become monsters. You are safe, you are still, and somewhere, deep in dream's quiet passage, the terrible keep walking, not to hurt, but to warn. Because some warriors don't guard kingdoms, they guard the soul. Welcome again, quiet traveler. If you're still with me, then your body has likely settled into stillness, your mind unfolding like parchment beneath the ink of night, ready to hold one more story, or 100. We are no longer in the realm of history as you know it. We have passed the boundaries of what's written and what's remembered. Now we move through what was whispered, carved into stone walls too deep to find, or buried beneath silence so thick even time forgot to listen. Tonight, we begin again, with a warrior who never held steel, who never touched armor, and yet who held more power than kings. She was a midwife, born to a line of women who bled in the woods and died in fields, unknown, unsung. She knew the shape of suffering, knew how bones break when birthed wrong, knew what it meant to take life and give it in the same moment. Her village was conquered when she was 20. Soldiers lined her people up and asked who the healer was. She stepped forward, not with pride, with stillness. They spared her, then used her, made her tend to their wounded. She did, for years, but she also listened, learned their names, their weaknesses, their fears. When the war was over, those soldiers began dying slowly, painfully, from ailments no one could name, not fast enough to be suspicious, but one by one. And when they died, they dreamed of crying children and knives made of bone. They say her touch was gentle, but her memory was sharper than any blade. She was called the Last Breath, and no army dared touch her land again. There was a monk who refused to walk on stone. He believed the earth felt pain, and that cities were wounds. He wandered barefoot, only on dirt paths, only through fields. But he was not harmless. He trained his body to bend like branches, to break like ice. He disarmed knights without striking. He broke swords by touching them. People followed him, believing him to be a prophet. But he said nothing, just walked. And when war came, he disappeared into a tree. Literally. They carved it open years later and found it hollow, with roots shaped like hands. No one ever found him again. But the cities he passed through, they grew quieter, softer. People built gardens where streets had been. And still, they whisper his name, Ashstep. In the far isles, where fog rises thicker than thought, a ferryman rode between ruined villages. He never charged, never spoke, just arrived when needed. People climbed in, and sometimes they returned. Sometimes they didn't. But those who did say they saw their regrets on the water, reflections not of faces but of choices, of wounds they'd given and received. The ferryman didn't judge, he just rode. But those who stepped off his boat walked differently, carried themselves like they'd laid something down, something heavy. They called him the Passage, and when storms come, islanders still leave coins by the shore not to pay, but to thank him for letting them return. A terrible warrior doesn't always shed blood. Sometimes they hold it in their hands and ask softly, why? There was a man who could hear truth, not lies. Truth, the core of what someone meant, buried beneath their words. He trained as a soldier, then as a scribe, then as a judge, but he left all three, saying, justice should not wear armor. He wandered into conflict zones, knelt between enemies, and listened. Just listened. And then he spoke. And when he did, people laid down swords, not because he was convincing, but because they felt seen. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was final. They called him the Listener, and his presence was banned by 5 kingdoms. Still, he kept walking. There was a weaver who embroidered pain, not her own others. She would sit beside wounded men and women, ask nothing but feel their breath, their tremble, their silence, and she would stitch. Her tapestries held things too deep for words. When kings saw them, they cried. When generals saw them, they resigned. She never revealed how she captured pain so precisely. But once, a dying knight asked, "Why do you do this?" And she said, "Because someone has to carry it." She was called Needleveil, and her tapestries now hang in ruins, untouched by time. In the deepest well of a desert where no sand dared move, a child was left for dead. He survived by listening to stone, to the breath beneath ground. He learned to move without sound, to wait longer than thirst. When he returned, he moved through cities unseen, not a thief, a guardian. He marked the cruel with signs no one could see, but animals sensed them. Wind turned cold around them, and when they slept, dreams carried warnings. He never struck, but people changed, grew kinder, or vanished. They called him Hollow Dust, and the desert welcomed him like kin. A man once made maps of things that didn't exist. Cities of grief, rivers of regret, mountains of betrayal. People laughed, but when war tore through the land, his maps helped survivors find paths no one knew, places of refuge, caves that hadn't existed before. His maps moved, shifted. Some said he wrote with ink made of tears, others said the maps read him. But all agreed, if you held one, you found more than safety, you found truth. He was known as the cartographer of wounds. And though no one saw him die, one day the maps stopped changing. One last warrior lived in silence because every word she spoke became real. She learned this after saying, "I hate you," and watching a boy's heart stop. From then on, she wrote everything. Orders, prayers, names. Her voice was a sword, her silence, armor. She fought by standing still, and when threatened, she whispered, "Once," and that was enough. They say her final words were, "Let this end." And the war did. Overnight, people woke to quiet. No armies, no banners, just peace. For a moment, her body turned to ash, but her words still echo in valleys, still tremble in the air before storms. She was the voice-bound, and her legend reminds us that the most terrible warriors are not always loud. Sometimes they are the hush before the scream. As you drift now, weightless, warm, remember this: history remembers the loud, but the world is shaped by the quiet ones, by those who carried horror not to wield it, but to keep it from others. You are safe, you are heard, and somewhere the terrible still walk not to harm, but to protect the silence they fought so hard to earn. The night is thick around you now, not in fear but in softness, like a worn blanket that holds not just warmth, but memory. The kind of memory that doesn't speak but hums in the bones, gently, slowly. If your eyelids have grown heavier, that is right. If your breath comes slower, deeper, that is right too. This space we share is not built of time, but of quiet. And in that quiet, stories stir not for the world above, but for you here now, as you drift deeper into the forgotten folds of history. This is the chapter of those warriors whose terribleness did not come from bloodshed, but from the way they rewrote the meaning of power. Let me tell you of the girl they called Mothlight. She was blind, born with eyes like cloudy pearls, but she saw other things. She walked into rooms and knew what had been taken. She touched walls and felt who had screamed against them. Her fingers traced the air and caught secrets like threads. She never raised her voice, never cursed, never fled. But when a cruel duke tried to silence the poor by burning their books, Mothlight walked into his keep with nothing but a scarf. By morning, every servant had left. The duke stood alone. His walls whispered back every word he'd ever spoken, until he tore at his own throat, trying to make the echoes stop. The scarf was found on his bed, embroidered with one word: listen. In the mountains of glass, where light reflected into madness, a woman known only as the Shardwalker survived by not blinking. She believed that blinking allowed lies to slip in, and so she trained herself to keep her gaze wide, unbroken. She fought only once, when mercenaries tried to steal the last spring from a dying village. She stood between them and the water, unarmed, unblinking. They laughed, and then they stopped. One by one, they dropped their swords, not from guilt, but from shame. Her gaze didn't accuse, it revealed. They saw themselves in her pupils, and what they saw, they could not bear. No blood was spilled, but no one ever returned. Her eyes became legend. Some said they reflected your truest fear. Others said they reflected your mother. The truth was simpler. They reflected who you chose to become, and that was worse than fear. In the Boglands, where air clings to skin like breath from the dead, there lived a child with no name. She was raised by crows, not fed, not carried, just watched. When she cried, they cawed. When she bled, they followed. As she grew, her hair tangled with feathers, her voice cracked like wings. She fought with nothing but nails and silence. When bandits came, she didn't warn them. She simply stood still, and they forgot why they came. Days later, their bodies were found tangled in roots, faces turned skyward, eyes pecked clean. The crows never spoke, but the message was clear. She belonged to the silence now. They called her the Scare Witch. And when the wind shifts wrong, farmers still hang black cloths on their doors, hoping she keeps walking. There was a man who could not feel heat. He walked through fire like others walk through fog. At first, he was feared, then worshipped, then caged. But he never spoke, never fought, until the day his captors burned a child to prove a point. Then he moved, not quickly, not violently, just deliberately. He walked from one end of the city to the other, through hearths and forges, setting nothing alight, yet leaving behind ash. Only ash. Buildings stood. People vanished. No one knew how. He left the city empty and sat down in its square. The air around him shimmered. No flame touched him, but nothing grew there again. They called him the Ember Rest, not because he destroyed, but because after him things did not rise. There was an old woman who dreamed of wars before they happened. Not as visions, as smells. She'd wake to the scent of blood or oil or copper and know a city would fall within the week. She tried to warn people. They laughed. Until they didn't. She began walking, leaving bundles of herbs on thresholds, strange knots tied in string. Those who kept them survived. Those who burned them vanished. Some say she was cursed. Others say she cursed the world by noticing. Either way, she became the crone of smoke. And when your dog growls at nothing, or your child wakes whispering of salt and steel, they say she's nearby, tying knots only time can untangle. A boy once refused to eat, not from sickness, but from grief. His brother had died in battle, forgotten by his lord. So the boy swore he would carry no banner, eat no feast, speak no oath. He wandered alone, thin as shadow, but people began following him. First one, then 10, then hundreds. They all swore silence, hunger, stillness. They became an army without weapons, without sound. They stood on the borders of warring nations and stared, and kings turned back, not from fear of battle, but from shame. The boy never spoke. But every year, on the date his brother died, a new patch of land declared peace. They called him the Famine Saint. He called no one, but the earth listened. On cliffs shaped like teeth, a sculptor carved stories into stone. Not myths, truths. Ugly truths of cowardice, betrayal, failure. He carved his own face again and again, each time a little more broken. When war came to his village, he made statues of the invaders before they arrived. Each bore a secret none should know, a mother's name, a lover's fear, a scar hidden by armor. The soldiers turned back, unnerved. He kept carving. One day, his hands bled too much to hold tools. So he lay down. Let the wind shape his final story. His cliffs still crumble. But the faces remain, not as warnings, as mirrors. You've heard of warriors with swords, but these ones, they fought with memory, with guilt, with silence. As your breath slows, as your mind grows heavy, let them hold you. Not to frighten, but to remind you. Power does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it simply sees you as you are and chooses not to look away. You've come so far now that time no longer presses against your skin, no longer tugs at your thoughts, or knocks gently against your chest like a drum waiting to be played. In this space, time drifts like fog, and your breath joins it, slow and steady, a tide that needs no shore. The stories we walk through now are softer at the edges, not because they lack power, but because they've worn through centuries like river stones, smoothed not by forgetting, but by being held, again and again, in the quiet palms of those who remembered not to speak them aloud. This is the part of the journey where terrible warriors are not who you expect, not swordsmen or generals, but seamstresses, bakers, children, strangers whose names were never written, only felt. There was a man who cooked only in silence. He ran a bakery at the edge of a ruined village where no one smiled and no birds sang. Every loaf he made was shaped like a face, no two the same. People came to buy them not out of hunger, but because when they bit into the bread, they remembered something they had buried. A laugh, a voice, a broken promise. Some wept. Some fell to their knees. Some fled. He never spoke, just kneaded dough and baked it with hands that trembled, as if he were remembering too. One day, the ovens were cold. No bread, no man. Just a note carved into flour on the counter. You were always enough. He was never seen again. But the village smiled for the first time in a generation. They called him the Crumb Father. And when the wind smells like cinnamon and ash, people set an extra place at the table, just in case. In a sunless valley, a woman painted the sky. Not with pigments or canvas, but with mirrors, strings, and flame. She built contraptions that caught light and flung it upward across clouds and mist, creating stars where none had been. Her people, trapped by fog and sorrow, came to watch the heavens she invented. They believed again, sang again, fought no more. When invaders came, they found a valley lit not by torches, but by reflections of old constellations, brighter than anything they'd seen. They dropped their blades, sat down, watched the stars until dawn. The woman never claimed credit. She just adjusted her mirrors, whispered to her fire, and left light behind. They called her Skybraid. And when the fog lifts in spring, sometimes the clouds shine in ways no sun can explain. A blacksmith once made armor so perfect, it fit without measure. But it wasn't meant for warriors. It was made for the broken. Men who had lost sons. Women who had buried daughters. He wrapped them in steel not to protect but to hold. They wore the suits like second skin, and within them they healed. They stood straighter, slept deeper, spoke again. When war came, they were ready not to kill, but to stand between blades and children. They didn't fight back, they just held. The soldiers broke against them, confused, afraid. No blood spilled, just silence. The blacksmith was never found again, but his forge stayed warm for 100 years. People still find scraps of metal in the dirt, shaped like hearts, like hands. In the reeds of a silent marsh, a girl stitched boats from the clothes of the dead. Each vessel small, barely wider than a hand. She set them afloat at dusk, one after another, never looking back. People laughed, called it childish. But then dreams came. The dead returned not as ghosts, but as warmth, as songs hummed beneath breath, as hands remembered from cradle or comfort. Her boats carried grief away, not to banish it, to honor it. One day, she was gone. The marsh bloomed lilies, and the water stilled forever. They called her Threadwake, and mourners still send scraps of cloth into rivers, hoping she finds them. There was a boy with a bell. He rang it once each morning, never spoke, just walked the city's edges, ringing. People mocked him until the day he didn't ring. That morning, the city burned, a fire no one saw coming. Afterward, they begged him to return. He did, rang again, and nothing bad happened. He kept walking, kept ringing. No one knew how he knew, but they gave him food, clothes, a place to rest. And one day, he rang the bell and vanished. The sound echoed for hours. They say he walks still, in cities on the brink, a warning not of death, but of chance to change. In the oldest forest, a woman carved names into bark, not of heroes, of forgotten beggars, widows, children, each name whispered once and etched with reverence. Trees grew faster around her. Bears bowed their heads. When soldiers came to cut the forest, their axes broke, their torches wouldn't light. One souled year tried to shoot her. The bullet turned into a flower midair. She smiled, vanished. Trees closed behind her. Now the forest has no paths. But sometimes, a name appears in the bark yours, perhaps, and those who find it remember who they were before they learn to forget. There was a dancer who spun not for applause but for time. Each step rewound seconds. Each turn bought back a breath. She danced in plague halls and burning churches and collapsing bridges, and people lived. Just one more breath, just one more goodbye. But each spin cost her memory. She forgot her name, her home, her mother's face, but she kept dancing until one day she stopped, bowed, and crumbled into ash. People say if you need her, just hum and turn in place, and she might give you one more second. One last warrior built stairs. Only stairs. Stone ones, twisting, leading nowhere. But when people climbed them, they cried, laughed, forgave. The higher they climbed, the clearer they felt. And when they reached the top, there was no view. Just sky, just wind. And when they came back down, they were different. Softer, braver, kinder. The warrior never explained why, just kept building. Some say the stairs are inside us now, and when we close our eyes, we're already climbing. You are safe here, still, floating in silence spun from old breath, old pain, old beauty. Let these stories settle like dust on your skin. Let them wrap around your bones. The most terrible warriors in history are not nightmares. They are memories of mercy sharpened by sorrow. You are safe. You are still, and the night holds you gently as you fall. You're still here, which means your body knows the rhythm now. The hush between each heartbeat, the slow sinking into layers beneath layers where names blur and faces melt into stories. This is not history as it was told in schools, carved into stone by hands that needed power. This is the other history. The one told when fires burn low, when the wind forgets where it was going, and when the soul leans forward not to speak, but to hear. Tonight, we return again to the terrible, but not the monsters, not the tyrants, the ones who changed everything just by being. Let me show you the warrior who never slept. She didn't fear rest. She just refused to miss a moment. They say her eyes stayed open from the day her village burned to the day her breath left her. While others closed their eyes to pray or to weep, she watched. She saw what others denied. And she remembered. She carved those memories into walls, into her skin, into songs she never sang aloud. When war reached her again, she stood in silence and held up a mirror not of glass, but of memory. Soldiers looked and saw the faces of those they'd forgotten. Some screamed, some begged, some dropped their weapons and ran. She never spoke, never smiled, just watched. Her name was forgotten, but her gaze wasn't. They call her the Watcher Beneath. And when thunder wakes you for no reason, they say she's reminding you, stay awake. A boy once grew up in ruins where wind howled through bones of buildings and the ground was salted so nothing lived. But he found seeds in broken teeth of statues. He planted them, watered with tears. One sprouted, then 5, then fields. And when warlords returned to claim the land, they found flowers instead of weapons, laughter instead of fear. The boy stood with hands full of blossoms and said nothing. The warlords lowered their banners and wept. They didn't know why, just that the scent reminded them of mothers. He was never crowned, never thanked, but his flowers still grow. They call him the Root Prince. In a chapel forgotten by even the crows, a girl wrote prayers for people who never believed. She lit candles for thieves, for cowards, for liars, not to save them, but to remember they existed. Her ink was ash, Her parchment, old sheets of confession, people came not to repent, but to be seen. She offered no absolution, only presence. And people changed. Not because they were forgiven, but because someone listened. When fire took the chapel, they found her sitting, untouched, a candle in each hand, both still lit. Her hands had turned to stone, her face soft. They called her the last confessor. And when guilt claws at your ribs in the dark, she might be near, waiting to hear without judging. In a cliffside village that vanished from maps, an old man built wind chimes from armor, helmets, breastplates, greaves. He melted them down, reshaped them into fragile bells that rang only when the wind remembered pain. The sound was not sweet. It scraped the soul, but people came anyway, to listen, to remember. Some left coins, others left letters. The old man never asked for stories, but the chimes told them anyway. One day, the wind stopped. So did the chimes. The village emptied. But on stormy nights, people say you can hear a melody that sounds like sorrow turned into song. They called him the Smith of Regret. In the salt mines where children once toiled, and coughed and faded, one child escaped, not through tunnels, but through song. She hummed so softly it made walls shift. She sang until cracks formed, until chains rusted, until guards forgot why they were cruel. One by one, the children followed her voice out. Years later, she sang to no one. Just wandered ruins, her voice now older, softer, sadder. When someone asked her name, she said, "You already know it," then vanished. Her song still haunts wells, not as ghosts, but as lullabies. They call her the Songless Queen, because when she died, silence wept. There was a shepherd who never led sheep. He led silence. Through mountains, across battlefields, into palaces. He never spoke, just walked, and silence followed. He'd enter a riot, and it would hush. Not from fear, from reverence. His staff bore no carvings, his cloak had no color, but people bowed. And the moment he passed, they felt clean, as if their sins had been seen and accepted. No one knows his origin, just that he walks still. And if the wind dies suddenly, and your ears ring with stillness, they say you've walked where he did. A potter in the burned north once made bowls too deep, deeper than hands. People poured water, and it vanished. But when they listened, they heard voices familiar, loving, distant. His bowls were not for eating. They were for remembering, for grief, for letting go. He gave them freely, and people left his hut lighter, slower, more whole. He was found one day inside a bowl, smaller than he'd ever been, asleep. No one woke him. They call him Clay Dream, and his bowls still appear in doorways after funerals. A woman once drew maps of what people feared, not geography emotion, despair, shame, rage. She used ink made from soot and fingernails. She never spoke, just offered the maps. People followed them, and at the end of each map was a mirror. They looked. Some screamed, some sang, some left their weapons behind. The woman? She drew the maps until her hands bled. Then she drew with blood, then with memory, then with air. And when she vanished, people kept finding maps, folded in books, in dreams, in the backs of eyes. She was the cartographer of fear. And when you feel lost, maybe you're following one of hers. A terrible warrior is not always a hero. Sometimes they are a wound that refused to rot, a question that never got an answer, a candle lit when no one else cared to strike a match. And as you drift, as your breath slows and your thoughts soften, let that be enough. You are safe. You are seen. And somewhere, even now, the terrible still walk, not to fight, not to win, but to remember the battles no one else dared speak aloud. Now the night folds in around you like cloth too soft to name, like fog that carries memory not forward, not backward, but inward, where stories sleep until someone dares to whisper them again. And you, yes, You have come far enough to hear the ones even the wind forgets. These are not warriors of conquest. They are the kind of terrible who leave marks not on battlefields, but in the space between words, between glances, between breaths. There was a woman who never touched metal. She believed iron carried sorrow, so she built from bones, from reeds, from woven ash. Her armor cracked when struck, but always reformed. Her shields hummed with memory. She taught women who had lost everything to hold spears made of grief and dance instead of fight. When raiders came, they found nothing but music. And when they struck, their swords shattered, not from force, but from recognition. They heard the cries of the mothers they'd orphaned, the laughter of children they'd silenced. The raiders ran. The village remained. They called her the Bone Weaver. Her workshops were burned by kings. But her dance? It still finds those who have lost too much and teaches them to move again. In a city paved with teeth, a boy grew up speaking only in questions. Every sentence ended not in doubt, but in curiosity sharp enough to draw blood. Why did you hurt her? Who told you that was right? Do you sleep well? His voice was not loud, but it echoed, and once heard, it followed you into silence. Kings outlawed him. Priests cursed him, but mothers whispered his words to sons. The boy grew older. Questions became fewer, sharper, and one day he asked only one. What would happen if we stopped lying? No one answered. The city fell silent for a week. When it spoke again, laws had changed. People apologized. They said his name softly, the question blade. There was a baker who only cooked when someone cried. Her ovens lit with tears. Her recipes changed with sorrow. She made pies that held farewells, breads that forgave, cakes that buried shame beneath cinnamon and clove. People traveled miles just to weep outside her door. She never asked why, just baked. And when they left, they felt lighter. She never married, never aged. One day the oven went cold. A note on the counter read, "I've cried enough." They buried the note in sugar. Her recipes are lost. But sometimes, when you cry near fire, you smell vanilla. A knight once wore no armor, only ink. His skin was covered in names of those who had died while others watched. He made no accusations, just showed up, stood still. And when people read the names, they remembered. They ached. Some begged forgiveness. Others fled. His presence was considered a curse, but he brought no plague, just truth. His last tattoo was blank, framed by a single word, yours. His body was never buried. They say he turned into a book. And when you open the right page in the right moment, you find a name you forgot, one you need to say out loud. A mother once sang lullabies in a language no one else spoke. Her children grew fearless. Her neighbors slept better. Her enemies dreamed of forgiveness. When war stole her voice, she hummed. When it stole her hum, she tapped rhythms. And when it stole her hands, she blinked patterns into the air. She taught without words, loved without end. When she died, the village fell silent for 7 years. Birds didn't sing, trees didn't creak, wind didn't blow. One day, a baby laughed, and the silence broke. Her grave is unknown, but her lullaby? It lives in the rustle of leaves, in the hush before rain, in the breath between sob and smile. They call her the Everhush. A man once guarded a bridge no one needed. It led nowhere, spanned no river, but he stood day and night, sword at his side, gaze fixed. People mocked him, called him mad, until one day a fire tried to cross, not flame. Fire itself rage, cruelty, war. It walked like a man, spoke like thunder, but the guard stood firm. Didn't strike, just whispered, "Not here," and the fire burned out. Now the bridge is watched by no one. But if you try to cross with ill intent, your feet grow heavy, your voice chokes, your eyes sting. They say he still stands not in body, but in will. He was the Ember Bridge. A girl once told only lies, but her lies came true. She said the sky would turn green, and it did. She said wolves would speak, and they did. At first, people feared her, then followed, then asked for blessings. But she grew tired. She had lied 1,000 things into being, and none brought her peace. One day she whispered, "I was never real," and faded. Some say her lies still shape the world. That wishing is just lying with hope. That prayer is lying with trust. They called her never true, and if you say something you don't mean near a flame, watch the smoke, it might spell her name. A thief once stole only guilt. He'd enter homes, markets, palaces not for gold, but for shame. He'd find it, take it. And people woke feeling light, confused, but new. He carried guilt in jars, buried them in swamps, fed them to crows, until one day he stole a guilt too large, his hands cracked. His heart stuttered, he fell, but in that moment, thousands slept well. Children laughed, wars paused. His body was never found. But guilt, now, grows harder to carry, because someone once proved it can be lifted. They call him the weightless sin. And when you feel just a bit lighter after dreaming, he may have passed by. These are not tales of greatness, but of gravity. People who pressed so deep into the world, they changed its shape. And now, as your breath grows gentler, as your limbs melt into stillness, let their stories hold you. You are safe. You are not alone. And somewhere, the terrible still walk, not to conquer, but to carry, to witness, to whisper, you matter. Even now. Especially now. By now, your breathing has become part of this story. Each inhale, a quiet turning of the page. Each exhale, a step deeper into a place that exists beyond memory, beyond time. You've allowed yourself to drift far enough from the world of doors and clocks and names that the terrible can visit safely. Not the kind of terrible that wounds, but the kind that witnesses, that refuses to look away. That lives not to destroy, but to endure. These warriors did not fight in the way stories often demand. They survived. And in surviving, they made others remember what it means to be human. There was once a woman who painted scars. Not to hide them, but to finish them. She'd trace over old wounds with gold, with ash, with thread, turning pain into pattern, shame into shape. People came from war camps and hospitals, from prisons and cloisters. She painted until their stories made her weep, and she wept until the tears ran gold. One day, a prince came with a scar so deep it split his soul. She touched it and vanished. The prince never smiled again, but he never raised a sword again either. Her name was never written, but her work remains in every healed thing that dares to still shine. In the deserts beyond any map, a man wrote stories on wind. He'd speak into dunes, and days later, travelers would hear his voice through the sand. His tales warned, comforted, forgave. He never left footprints, his tent was never found, but lost children would follow whispers back to safety. Dying men would find shade and weep. He was called the dust scribe, and when wind makes words of silence, it may be him still speaking. A child once carried stones from a cursed river. Each stone held grief, bound in silence and iron. She carried them to the top of a mountain and sang to them. One by one, the stones cracked, and people below felt lighter, wept, forgave. No one believed her at first until one day, the river ran clear. The curse had been grief, and she had lifted it. Not with power, but with effort. With song. Her voice was never recorded. But some mornings, mountain echoes carry lullabies no one remembers learning. There was a gardener who planted only weeds. Not by choice, everything he touched refused to bloom, but he kept planting. People laughed, then watched. Because the weeds brought bees. The bees brought birds. The birds brought seeds. And soon wildflowers rose among weeds. Beauty born not from control, but surrender. When he died, they tried to tend his garden. Nothing grew. Until someone planted a weed again. Then everything returned. He was called the root fool. But fools often know what wisdom forgets. A woman once collected laughter. She wandered cities with a jar and asked strangers to laugh into it. Some gave real laughs. Some forced it. Some refused. But over years, her jar filled with something bright. She opened it only once on a battlefield. And the sound was so joyful, so real, that soldiers dropped their blades and laughed. Some cried, some hugged. The war ended in one breath. Her jar cracked. She was gone. But sometimes, when sorrow is too loud, someone laughs and no one knows why. That's her. Still echoing. A knight once protected nothing. He built no wall, guarded no king. But he stood at the edge of every place people tried to forget. He wore armor made of others' regrets, carried a shield painted with every broken promise. And when people saw him, they remembered, they wept. They forgave. He never struck a blow, just held a line no one else would. One day, he sank into the ground, armor and all. Flowers grew there, not gentle ones, fierce, bright, wild. He was the last sentinel, and if you find yourself crying near forgotten places, he might be near. There was a girl who spoke only in dreams. She'd touch your hand, and your next sleep would bring a truth you denied. She showed fathers their cruelty, mothers their fear, lovers their lies. Some called her a curse, others a blessing. She took no payment, carried no possessions, just moved from town to town, hand to hand, truth to truth. One day, no one dreamed, and people panicked. But that night, the stars blinked in a pattern only she had ever drawn. Her work was done. They called her the Dream Tongue. And when your sleep brings a lesson, painful but needed, thank her. A man once made music only for animals. He played flutes carved from bone, harps made of grass, drums made of river rock. No human understood his songs, but wolves curled at his feet, bears wept, birds followed him in flocks. When poachers came, he played one note and the forest rose. Trees closed in, the sky darkened. No one died, but the poachers ran and never returned. He stayed in the woods, played still. And when you walk alone among trees and feel safe, even watched, it might be because he's playing, and the forest still remembers the melody. A scholar once erased knowledge. Not lies true, precious things, but he believed some truths were poison, that knowing them too early or too quickly broke people. So he wandered libraries, journals, carvings. He'd remove one sentence, one fact, just enough to slow the rush. People hated him, called him the unreader. But years later, those who found his edits learned patience, learned depth, learned how to ask. He wasn't wrong, just early. And when something slips your mind at the perfect time when forgetting saves you, it may be his hand. Terrible warriors do not always leave marks in blood. Sometimes they leave understanding in silence. Sometimes they remind the world how fragile it is not to break it, but to protect it better. As you breathe now, slowly, deeply, safely, let these stories hold you. Let them whisper to the part of you that has fought battles no one else saw. You are not alone. You are not weak. You are seen. And somewhere, perhaps closer than you think, the terrible still walk quietly, watching, waiting, helping the world become just soft enough to let you sleep. It is almost over now, though the night still holds you and breathes around you like a tide that never truly recedes, just pulls gently at the edges of your thoughts, inviting you to let go a little more, to rest a little deeper, to remember that your bones have stories, that your breath has rhythm, that your heart has listened longer than you've known. You have walked with the terrible for so long now that they no longer feel strange, no longer wear masks of fear or danger, but seem like quiet guardians at the edge of memory, witnesses to things you carry without names. In this final stretch of night, we turn not to battles, not to stories of blades and shields and scars, but to the kinds of warriors who made war unnecessary, who altered the very shape of pain, who rewrote what resistance could be. There was a woman who walked into every room backwards, not for performance or attention, but because she believed no one should be surprised by sorrow. She'd enter in reverse, gaze steady, and only turn to face people when she was ready to see everything they didn't say. People at first mocked her, then waited for her. Her presence became ritual. Arguments ended when she arrived. Secrets softened. Grief was named. She never offered solutions. She just faced what others wouldn't. When she died, she was buried facing west. And now, at dusk, when shadows stretch long and backward, people say she walks again. A man once built houses that vanished the moment they were no longer needed. They appeared at night, warm and safe, for the weary and the lost, then disappeared with the sunrise. No walls, no footprints, just peace left behind. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he'd made a deal with the stars. But all who found his shelters wept, not because they were sad, but because for the first time in years they felt held. He left no name, but if you wake in a field and feel rested, if you remember a roof that never existed, he may have built for you. A child once spoke only in reflections. She'd repeat back not what you said, but what you meant. Adults avoided her. Children followed her. Her eyes held mirrors not literal, but shimmering with recognition. One day, she said to a king, "You are afraid of being loved." He laughed, then cried, then gave away his crown. She vanished the next morning. Her reflection remained in fountains across the land. People called her the Echo Queen. And when you catch your own gaze in still water and feel understood, she is near. A monk once translated silence into song. Not just quiet, but the true silence, the kind found between heartbeats, between sobs, between the closing of one life and the opening of another. He created music with no notes, just pauses. People listened and felt things they couldn't name: regret, hope, forgiveness. He died mid-rest, a pause too long, but his followers carried on. Some choirs sing nothing, yet move audiences to tears. That is his work. A woman once sewed coats that made people invisible not to others, but to their own shame. When worn, they no longer heard the voice that whispered they were not enough. People didn't abuse the coats. They walked straighter, hugged deeper, spoke more kindly. She never sold them, just gave them to those who cried without knowing why. Her last coat was left on a scarecrow in a burned field. The crops returned, so did the birds. They called her Threadshade. And when self-hatred lifts for no reason, it may be her seam still holding. There was a scribe who wrote apologies no one asked for. He sent them to strangers, to trees, to ghosts. "I'm sorry we forgot you. I'm sorry we feared your name. I'm sorry we made you silence your song." People received these letters and healed. Some thought it magic. Others thought it coincidence. But across the land, broken things mended. Wounds stopped weeping. The scribe never took credit, just kept writing. When he passed, his quill split in two. From it grew two vines, one weeping, one laughing. They call his grave the place of forgiveness. A dancer once moved only when someone else stood still. She existed to balance. At funerals, she spun. At births, she was still. At executions, she stepped softly behind the crowd, guiding grief. At weddings, she barely breathed. No one knew her name, but her presence calmed storms. One day, no one stood still. Everyone moved too quickly. She fell, broke, and wind has never danced the same since. There was a healer who never touched wounds. Instead, he told the stories of the injured back to them, but gentler, with hope folded into each retelling. People didn't forget their pain. They just remembered why they survived. His voice carried warmth, like firelight, like old songs. When he lost his voice, he began to draw. And those drawings told stories too. When he died, every patient he'd ever helped dreamed the same dream of being whole. A cartographer once drew maps to nowhere, but made people believe. Her maps had oceans that sang, mountains that wept, forests that laughed. People followed them, got lost. And in getting lost, found something better. Themselves, their pasts, their peace. When war came, generals asked her to draw enemy lands. She refused, said, "I draw only for healing." They killed her, but her last map, it couldn't be burned. It still appears in cracks in old walls, in folds of blankets, in veins of leaves. There was a boy who held mirrors to animals, just watched them react. Birds preened, cats attacked. Dogs tilted heads. He said nothing, just observed. then began building mirrors that reflected not appearance, but essence. He showed a violent man his own fear, a cruel woman her own child. Some changed, some shattered. His mirrors were feared, then lost. But people still speak of glimpses in puddles, in chrome, in dreams. Glimpses that feel like truth. The night draws long now, but you are not alone. These terrible warriors never left. They do not ask for worship, only remembrance. And as you drift further into the place beyond language, let them hold you. You are seen. You are safe. And the most terrible thing you can be is exactly yourself. Brave enough to feel, quiet enough to stay. Sleep leans closer now, slow and certain, like dusk folding over old hills, like a tide that carries not salt, but memory. Not pull, but promise. You've walked long alongside the terrible, seen their quiet work, heard their unspoken hymns, but now we reach the edge of even their world, where stories grow too soft to speak aloud, where language dissolves and only presence remains. These are the final ones, the warriors who stepped beyond violence, beyond name, who became verbs in the mouths of the forgotten and roots in the dreams of the weary. There was a woman who held only broken things, dishes, doles, promises, bones. She carried them not to fix, but to honor. She'd place them gently on shelves of moss and silk, whisper to them, thank them for surviving even in pieces. People brought her their grief-cracked heirlooms, torn pages, shattered hopes. She never asked for stories, but the broken things told them anyway. Her home became a museum of aching beauty. And when she died, the shelves turned into trees, and the trees bore fruit that glowed when touched gently. They called her the keeper of fractures. And when your heart feels held even when incomplete, it is her hands you remember. A man once refused to name anything, not out of fear or rebellion, but reverence. He believed that names pinned things down, made them smaller. So he pointed, nodded, hummed. People mocked him, then envied him, because the things he touched grew larger, richer, freer. A flower he merely glanced at would bloom again. A child he smiled at would speak more clearly. When he passed, people gathered to name him. But every title felt wrong, so they were silent. And in that silence, the wind whispered something that felt like gratitude. There was a girl who danced only when it rained. Her joy was not for sun or celebration, but for the storms, for the drenching, the dark, the renewal. People feared she summoned floods, but she didn't. She met them, matched their rhythm, and in doing so, softened their rage. Towns flooded less when she danced. Crops drank deeper. Trees bent, but did not break. One day, a drought came. She waited, hummed, then fell asleep. When the rain returned, it wept. And where she'd lain, a pond bloomed, deep and still. They called her the rain stepper. A healer once asked only one question. Where does it hurt most when no one is looking? People never answered aloud. They couldn't. But something opened. Something shifted. She would press a hand not to skin, but to shadow, and the pain would name itself, then dissolve. Her tools were breath and listening. Her cures were quiet. When war found her, she stood still, eyes closed, arrows missed. Swords turned away, even anger lost direction. She walked away untouched. Some say she walks still. A sculptor once carved things that hadn't happened yet. Statues of people no one knew, poses they hadn't lived. But one by one, the future arrived. A girl grew into the woman he'd shaped. A beggar learned to hold himself as the statue had shown. A city built a square that matched his vision. He never explained how. Just said, time visits everyone. I just opened the door. His last sculpture was of someone sleeping peacefully. The next morning, he was gone. But people sleep deeper near that statue. They say it holds the dreams he never spoke aloud. A priestess once lit fires for those not yet born. She'd pray for their courage, their softness, their clarity. She weaved lullabies into candle smoke. At night, she'd hum to the stars as if singing to infants not yet carried. People didn't understand. Then generations passed, and children arrived kind, gentle, strong in strange ways. The old remembered her, said, "She sang you here. Her temple burned." But sometimes, newborns stare into candle flames as if remembering a voice just beyond memory. There was a boy who laughed at fear, not to mock, but to make it smaller. When monsters came, he told them jokes. When war came, he tickled fate. His laughter wasn't defiance. It was invitation. Fear, confused, shrank. Courage, inspired, bloomed. He didn't survive childhood, but his giggles echo in battlefields where no one dies. His tombstone reads only, "He smiled." A singer once sang songs in languages she didn't know. They poured from her like rivers from a spring ancient, aching, alive. People understood them anyway, not with minds, but marrow. Her songs stopped fights, melted shame, pulled memories from dust. When she sang in court, justice softened. When she sang in prisons, men forgave. One day, her voice cracked. She smiled, said, "Enough has been said," then was quiet forever. But when music makes you cry for no reason, it is likely her echo. A blacksmith once made weapons that refused to be used. They'd melt in angered hands, bend in revenge. Only those who grieved could hold them. Only those who forgave could swing them. His shop was full of swords that sang, shields that wept. He said, "I make tools for peace disguised as war." People didn't believe him until they held one and wept. His forge still burns, unattended, in a mountain cave. The weapons still hum. A woman once walked into nightmares, not her own, but others. She'd enter when screams rose, when breath quickened. She'd touch the monster, name the fear, and turn the dream. People woke lighter, as if someone had carried the weight for a while. She never slept herself. Said, "My sleep is your freedom." One day, the nightmares stopped. People missed her, not the fear her. She visits still when your sleep edges toward terror. She's the one who whispers, "Not tonight." And the monster blinks, confused. The last warriors are not last because they are least, but because they waited. Waited until you were ready, until your body softened, your breath slowed, your mind opened wide enough to hold silence. They were always there, just beyond waking. And now they come not to fight or speak, but to sit with you in the hush before sleep takes you fully. You are not alone, you are not broken, you are enough. And the most terrible warriors in history walk still, not on roads of stone or battle, but across the fields of your dreams, the rivers of your quiet, the sky of your rest. Let them walk with you now, into the dark that is not frightening but whole. Now we are here, where night no longer deepens but simply is, where the breath you take is not a reaching but a resting, and the stories have walked you as far as they can, leaving only their shadows curled softly around your mind, warm and weightless, like blankets stitched of memory and myth. This is where the terrible warriors sleep, not in coffins or crypts, not beneath stones, but inside you, inside every breath you dared to take after breaking, every kindness you offered without being asked, every moment you listened instead of fleeing. These final names are not from books or walls or carved into swords. They are remembered not for their might, but for their stillness, not for the fear they spread, but for the silence they honored. There was a woman who painted rainbows no one could see. She said the world was full of colors, too soft for the eye, but loud in the heart. She mixed hues from breath, from silence, from the space between laughter and grief. When people stood near her work, they wept. Not because they saw it, but because they felt less alone. She vanished one morning, but light has shimmered strangely ever since. A boy once sang to stones, not to move them or break them, but to remind them of stories they had held for too long. Mountains shuddered, ruins sighed, tombs cracked just enough to release their sorrow. People feared him, then followed him. Wherever he walked, the ground softened. After he passed, earthquakes grew rarer. And when they did come, they hummed. There was a scribe who wrote only the spaces between words. He claimed those held the truth, the ache, the breath of meaning. People mocked him, then read his work and felt healed. They didn't know why. His last page was entirely blank. But every time someone stared at it long enough, they dreamed something they needed to remember. A woman once cried for people who could not. She'd find those who carried too much pain to release and weep in their place. Her tears watered dry hearts. Her sobs shook locked doors. She was called Mourner, not because she grieved, but because she knew sorrow must move. One day, she wept so deeply the sea rose. Islands formed where her tears cooled. Some live there still, unsure why the breeze feels like forgiveness. A monk once chanted the names of forgotten animals, not the mighty or extinct, but the overlooked, the beetles, the worms, the moss. He said every name carried a note in the world's song, and to lose one was to sing off key forever. He chanted until his voice cracked, then hummed. When he died, silence fell in forests, not in mourning, but reverence. Birds sang in unfamiliar melodies, as if making room for the missing verse. A man once danced without moving. His stillness held motion, his breath held rhythm. People sat with him and found their hearts sinking to his unseen beat. He healed rifts, not by speaking, but by being. After his death, strangers in marketplaces began pausing, stilling, breathing in time. No one knew why, but conflict softened. There was a girl who whispered secrets to stars. Not her own, but others. She'd listen at doors, behind curtains, inside dreams. Then, at night, she'd kneel and speak them skyward. Stars would flicker, as if receiving burdens too long carried. People who had whispered in shame felt lighter, freer, even if they never saw her. Some say shooting stars are her exhalations, a healer once tended only to silence. She'd walk into homes where no one spoke, not from peace, but from wounds. She'd sit, breathe, hum if needed, and slowly voices returned, not loud, not forced, but real. She believed silence was a language that needed translation, not fixing. Her house was always open. When she died, it became a library where people go not to read, but to breathe. A knight once defended dreams. He rode only at night, through fields of fear and towers of doubt. He'd appear in nightmares where someone cried alone and simply hold a lantern. That was all. But the light never went out. People woke remembering nothing but warmth. His armor was made of lullabies. His sword was sleep itself. He was called Sir Slumber. A woman once planted bells instead of seeds. They didn't grow, just rested. And when wind passed through them, the air sang truths too fragile for mouths. Some bells cried, some laughed, all healed. Her garden was quiet but alive. After her death, people found bells in wild places, beneath snow, inside caves. When rung, they recall something you needed but forgot. These are the final warriors. Not famous, not feared, just faithful to feeling, to stillness, to holding what others dropped. And now, they offer you their final gift. Permission. Permission to rest. To stop carrying. To stop fighting. You have done enough. You have walked through centuries tonight. Through myths and truths and the thin, soft space between. Let it all fall away now. You are here. You are safe. You are enough. The terrible are with you not in form, but in silence, in rhythm, in peace. Let their stories settle in your bones like dust in sunlight, like warmth in old stone. There is nothing more to hear, nothing more to do. Just breathe, and let the night have you gently.